Hey guys, tonight we're going way back, like leech bloodletting, castle chamber pot, plague cart back. You're about to explore some of the wildest medieval trends that genuinely existed and, let's be honest, probably should make a comeback, even if only for the pure absurdity of it. But fair warning, you probably won't survive this era, not just because of the diseases or the hygiene, or lack thereof, but because the fashion alone might actually kill you, spiritually at least. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start at your feet, because they are now enclosed in shoes that could be classified as medieval weapons. Welcome to the world of Krakau's, also known as poulaines, because of course they had to sound fancy. Imagine slipping into a pair of leather shoes with toe extensions that stretch a good 2 feet beyond your actual toes. They're like clown shoes, but with more nobility and slightly more stabbing hazard. You're clopping through cobblestone streets, your balance teetering like a baby deer, and every step is a high-stakes gamble. These shoes were so absurd that laws had to be passed regulating the length of the tips. That's right, government-enforced toe limits. The 1380s were wild. You probably think you look ridiculous, and you do, but that's kind of the point. In medieval Europe, nothing said, "I have excessive wealth and zero intention of doing manual labour," like footwear that made walking a nightmare. The longer the shoe, the higher your social status. So yes, someone once looked at a functional shoe and thought, not nearly enough trip risk, add 4 inches. Some poulaines had their points stuffed with moss or even reinforced with whalebone so they kept their deadly shape. Which, let's face it, kind of slaps in a ridiculous couture way. But the absurdity doesn't stop there. You're walking into a banquet hall trying not to trip over your own social status, and you notice a whole culture built around pointing out your weirdly long shoes. Monks complained about them in sermons, saying they were signs of moral decay. Chronicles recorded noblemen wearing them to church. You can't kneel, you can't run, you can barely dance without jabbing your partner in the shin, and yet everyone is doing it. It's 1390 and you're basically doing catwalk cosplay every time you step outside. Here's where it gets weirder. Some scholars think poulaines weren't even originally European. There's a debate about their origin, whether they came from Poland, hence the name Krakow, or the Middle East via returning crusaders. It's possible knights brought them back as war souvenirs, which would be the most on-brand knight behaviour ever. I saw death, glory, and ancient ruins. Also, check out these shoes. We don't have consensus, but it does raise the image of a crusader trying to fight off enemies while wearing stabby footwear extensions. Spoiler, that guy probably died first. But wait, quirkier still is that poulaines sparked something like an ancient footwear arms race. Not to be outdone, lower classes started wearing their own longer shoes, mimicking the nobles. This of course led to nobles making theirs even longer, until King Edward IV finally had to step in and say, "Guys, 12 inches, max." Imagine being the King of England and that's the crisis on your desk. Footwear legislation. The medieval world, come for the knights, stay for the bureaucratic toe drama. By this point in the evening, your archers are screaming, your shoes have taken out a candle holder, and you're slowly realising that medieval beauty standards were just torture with better branding. But admit it, there's a small part of you that wants to see these return. Imagine a modern runway show with full poulaines. You wouldn't just walk, you'd command airspace. No one could ignore you if your shoes had their own zip code. And sure, today's fashion has its extremes. Oversized sleeves, latex jumpsuits, whatever's going on with avant-garde shoulder pads. But somehow, foot daggers feel like they deserve a second chance. Maybe not for running a 5k, but as a statement piece? Oh, absolutely. You could even store snacks in the toe. Medieval practicality, baby. Now before you hang up those extravagant slippers, here's something delightfully bonkers. At least one bishop allegedly banned clergy from wearing poulaines in church. Why? Because the toes curved so far upward, people suspected demonic symbolism. Yep, your shoes are literally too cursed for mass, which honestly might be the highest compliment fashion can receive. So iconic, it's heresy. So here you are, your ankles mildly sprained, your sense of balance completely wrecked, and yet your confidence sky high. Because in medieval society, looking like an impractical disaster meant you were winning. Form over function? No, form in violent rebellion against function. And that's what we call style. You're back on your feet, barely, thanks to those ridiculous polanes, but tonight's medieval journey is just getting started. Take a moment to stretch your legs and maybe rub your ankles. You've earned it. Because now you're about to experience a moment in history so bizarre, so legally nonsensical, that it makes modern court TV look tame. That's right. You're heading into the medieval animal courtroom, and not as a spectator. Oh no, you're the prosecutor and your defendant is a pig. Yes, a pig. Possibly wearing a little outfit. See, in certain parts of medieval Europe, especially France and Switzerland, animals could be taken to trial, like actual court trials, with judges, witnesses, legal counsel, and occasionally the full weight of the justice system thrown at a particularly guilty-looking goose. The crime? Everything from property damage to, you guessed it, murder. And you better believe some of these pigs were sentenced to death, sometimes in full public executions with full solemn ceremony. Because nothing says law and order like hanging a cow. You step into the courtroom and you're immediately struck by the seriousness of it all. The pig, eyes wide and blissfully unaware, is penned in a wooden box like a criminal defendant. You make your case. She rooted through a garden, destroyed crops, maybe even bit a child. There are witnesses, a local farmer, a weeping grandmother, maybe a slightly dramatic priest. They testify, solemnly. And here's the wild part. There's a defense attorney. For the pig, a human one. That's not a joke. In some towns, lawyers were appointed to represent the accused animal, arguing mitigating factors. Maybe the pig was provoked. Maybe the child shouldn't have been poking it with a stick. Maybe she was acting on instinct, not malice. You're not in a courtroom anymore. You're in a Monty Python sketch with a legal budget. But don't laugh just yet. There's a quirky, almost philosophical logic underneath this. Medieval society was deeply rooted in a belief that the universe was an ordered place, that every creature had a role, and when that role was violated, cosmic justice had to be restored. If a pig killed a person, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a spiritual rupture. Justice had to be done, even if the accused couldn't tell a gavel from a turnip. Now you're watching the trial escalate. There's discussion of intention, of natural law. And when the sentence is handed down, you realise you're witnessing something that's both surreal and heartbreakingly sincere. The pig is found guilty. Execution is scheduled, in public. Sometimes the animal was even dressed in human clothes for the occasion, a twisted theatrical reminder of its crime. It's the Middle Ages, so of course things take a dark theatrical turn. You're not just shocked, you're oddly moved. Because weird as it is, there's something so deeply human about the whole thing. The desire to create meaning, to impose justice, even where logic tells you it doesn't belong. You can't exactly blame them. In a world where half the population couldn't read, where demons were just one bad dream away, and where the line between natural and supernatural was paper thin, of course people believed a rooster could commit heresy. Oh yes, that actually happened too. Roosters were put on trial for laying eggs, which as you might know is biologically impossible, so obviously people assumed witchcraft, or the devil, probably both. In 1474 in the town of Basel, a rooster was burned at the stake for the crime of laying an egg. Was it a fluke genetic mutation, a confused onlooker, or something stranger? Scholars still debate it. Some think these trials weren't always literal, more symbolic performances meant to reinforce social norms. Others think the belief was 100% sincere. Either way, it's weird. And here's your quirky fact of the night. In some towns, animal trials weren't limited to domestic livestock. Entire infestations were brought to court. Swarms of rats, hordes of weevils. A priest or town official would read out legal summons for the vermin, demanding they vacate the premises. No response, obviously, so the judge might escalate the situation by excommunicating them. Yep, kicked out of the church. You, sitting in the courtroom, are now watching a bishop threaten eternal damnation upon beetles. And the best part? Sometimes these excommunications worked. Not because of divine pest control, but because the humans got the message. Clean up your grain, fumigate the barn, or at least try something. In that sense, these trials were less about justice, and more about collective action wrapped in ritual and robes. But let's not ignore the real meat of this story. You, standing in a wood-panelled courtroom, passionately arguing against a goat while wearing a wool tunic that smells like anxiety. Because even in the absurdity, there's a strange appeal. It's almost comforting, this idea that justice applied to everyone, even animals, even rats. You broke the rules, you get a fair trial. Equal opportunity accountability plus livestock. By the time the court session ends, the pig has been escorted out with surprising dignity, and you're left wondering what on earth just happened. You argued in Latin, you cross-examined a stable boy, you might have even convinced the jury, and all this because some medieval villagers decided that justice was sacred, even if the accused just really wanted some cabbage. Sure, we've moved on to other methods like animal control and pest exterminators, but part of you has to admit, there's a weird sort of charm in bringing your grievances to court no matter who or what they're against. Think Judge Judy, but the defendant is a duck who stole bread. So next time you catch your cat knocking things off the table, just remember, in another time, another place, she could have been called to stand trial in front of a full jury, and honestly, she probably still wouldn't care. The courtroom clears out, the pig is led off with a guard on either side, probably the best day of that guard's life, honestly, and you step back into the chaotic, grimy, garlic-scented tapestry of medieval town life. But you're not here to rest. No, tonight you're dining like a knight. Not a polite pinky-out night sipping bone broth either. We're talking feasting, the kind that starts at noon and ends with someone unconscious under a trestle table. Welcome to the medieval banquet, where food is performance, dinner is diplomacy, and if you're not elbows deep in swan, are you even nobility? First things first, forget forks. They exist, kind of, but most people find them suspicious. Unholy, even. You'll be eating with your fingers, which means hand-washing is mandatory before the meal, and sometimes in between courses. They'll bring around rosewater basins for you to dip your grimy fingers into like you're bathing tiny royalty. It's all very elegant until someone drops half a pomegranate into the bowl. The table is long, rickety, and covered in what you think is a tablecloth, but could also be someone's old cloak. Doesn't matter. What matters is the food, and it is bonkers. You're served a trencher first, which isn't a dish, but a literal hunk of stale bread acting as your plate. You pile meat and sauces on top, and after you've soaked it with enough gravy to choke a bishop, you either eat it or give it to the poor. In theory, that's generosity. In practice, you're just passing along your food-soaked sponge bread to someone who doesn't get a choice. Now the meat parade begins. Boar's head with apples in its mouth, roasted peacock redressed in its own feathers, entire porpoises if you're near the coast and the bishop's feeling spicy. And the swan. Oh, the swan. It arrives glistening, spiced, probably smelling incredible, and looking deeply offended to be served like this. Because yes, it's cooked, and then reassembled in its plumage so it looks alive. Terrifying. Sure. Majestic. Also yes. The medieval dinner party is 1 part feast, 1 part pageant, and 2 parts unhinged edible taxidermy. But what really makes it sing, besides the troubadours in the corner trying to rhyme venison with maiden, is the seasoning. You're tasting cloves, cinnamon, ginger, spices that had to travel thousands of miles to be ground into the sauce currently dripping down your chin. This isn't just food, it's a flex. Spices are expensive, a marker of obscene wealth, so your hosts are bathing everything in them. Even the wine is spiced, even the eggs, even the fish jelly that no one wants but everyone pretends to like because the Duke is watching. Let's talk about that jelly for a moment, because it's your quirky fact of the evening. Medieval folks were obsessed with gelatinous foods. There's something about making a meat dish wobble like it's alive again that really tickled their fancy. Cooks made intricate moulds, layered jellies in vivid colours, and sometimes even trapped edible flowers or fish inside like some weird culinary snow globe. And if you think that's odd, consider this. One of the most prized dishes was a pie that exploded. Literally. A crust was baked around a hollow centre, and when it was cut open, live birds flew out. Ta-da! Surprise pigeons! Because why wouldn't you add bird chaos to the second course? You're seated next to someone of dubious rank who keeps trying to trade you pickled eel for a gulp of your spiced wine. Across from you, a knight is gnawing a rib like it owes him money. The music picks up, the minstrels hit a groove, and you realise this is less of a meal and more of a ritual. In medieval society, feasting isn't just about filling bellies, it's about hierarchy. Where you sit matters, what you eat matters, who carves the meat, who gets the first pour of ale, even who gets served by whom. It's all a subtle ballet of status, or a chaotic tumble, depending on how drunk the baron gets. There's scholarly debate about just how common these absurd feasts were. Were they reserved for royalty and the mega-rich? Probably. Did peasants also hold their own wild banquets when harvests were good, or saints needed celebrating? Also, yes. But the image we tend to carry, the impossibly long tables, the piles of roast beast, the fire-breathing performers riding donkeys through the hall, may be exaggerated by chroniclers trying to impress or mock the rich. Historians are still passing out where fact ends and flamboyance begins, but let's be honest, we're rooting for the flamboyance. Dessert arrives, if your gut still has room. Marzipan shaped like castles, candied rose petals, sugar sculptures depicting scenes from local legends, or just a naked man wrestling a fish. Sugar is incredibly expensive, imported and taxed and stored like treasure, so naturally it's used to make ridiculous things like edible chessboards. And as you nibble on a fruit tart the size of your face, you watch as the local lord stumbles to his feet to toast the guests, slurring something about honour, geese, and a recent brush with highwaymen. The feast is fading now, but the sounds linger. Harp strings, laughter, a muffled argument over who drank the bishop's mead. Your hands are sticky, your tunic smells like duck fat and cinnamon, and you've eaten at least 4 kinds of animal that might have had names. But there's something weirdly comforting about it all. The absurd excess, the strange etiquette, the communal chaos. In a world ruled by famine and fear, the feast is a defiant celebration of being alive, and having enough bread to throw at someone if they insult your mother. As the hall empties, you're left blinking by candlelight, stomach dangerously full, poultry feathers drifting through the air like confetti. You survived the medieval banquet. Congratulations. Just don't try to stand up too fast. The jelly's fighting back. You wake up in a hay-stuffed mattress, still burping up the ghost of yesterday's spice swan and sweetened fish jelly, and you think, maybe today will be different. It won't. Because as soon as you step out into the cold morning air, you're greeted by a lute-playing troubadour and the sultry sound of armoured flirting. That's right. You've wandered straight into the bizarre, awkward and aggressively poetic world of chivalric pickup lines. Medieval courtly love at its most cringe and most charming. You spot a knight leaning against a wooden post, armour glinting like he planned this moment for hours. Across the courtyard, a noble woman glances over her shoulder, pretending not to see him. He draws a long, dramatic breath and begins his verse. You're expecting something simple, maybe a, "Hey girl, you dropped that kerchief?" But no, this is the Middle Ages, and subtlety has been exiled from the kingdom. Instead, he launches into a 14-line poem comparing her eyes to divine fire and her forehead to a marble altar. Her reaction? A polite nod, the medieval version of thanks, I guess, and a quick retreat indoors. You, of course, can't help but try this ridiculous ritual yourself. You clumsily approach a maiden with hair braided like a cinnamon roll and deliver your best impression of a courtly suitor. "My lady," you begin, "thy smile doth pierce me like the sword of St. George, and my heart is but a thrashing boar in thy presence." She blinks. Somewhere, a donkey brays. You have embarrassed yourself in iambic pentameter. Here's the thing. Courtly love was never supposed to be normal. It wasn't about getting the girl or the guy or anything that resembled a real relationship. It was stylized, performative, and very, very extra. Picture a mashup of high school theatre, slow-burn fan fiction, and strict feudal hierarchy. You're not allowed to make physical moves. That would be vulgar. No, you write a sonnet and send it via a messenger who's also maybe a monk. And then you wait, and probably die of the plague before she replies. The whole system thrived on impossible longing. The woman, usually of higher rank and married, was supposed to be distant and unattainable. The man, a knight or poet or unfortunate jester, would pine endlessly, professing devotion in flowery language so convoluted you'd need a scribe just to decode the metaphors. It was a game, one designed to uphold ideals of virtue, loyalty, and emotional suffering disguised as romance. You weren't supposed to win the lady. You were supposed to suffer poetically about it, and then die heroically in battle, or of dysentery. Here's your historical fact for the night. Courtly love as a concept was heavily shaped by literature, not reality. The troubadours of the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in southern France, popularized this genre of romantic devotion, weaving it into the epic poems and songs of the time. Knights and noblemen eagerly adopted the language, and it spiraled into a full-blown lifestyle. Think of it as medieval roleplay with real-life consequences, because sometimes a misread line of poetry could start a duel, but not everyone was buying it. Here's where it gets spicy. Some scholars argue that courtly love was less about actual feelings and more about social strategy. a way for ambitious men to get closer to powerful women. After all, marrying up was rare, but wooing with the right combination of tortured stanzas and polished chainmail, slightly more plausible. Other academics suggest it was satire from the start, a literary joke that readers took a little too seriously. It's like someone writing an over-the-top love song and then watching an entire generation try to live by it. Your quirky fact for this chapter? In some courts, especially under Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen who basically invented cool girl royalty, there were actual love courts. Picture this. A group of noble ladies gathers in a candlelit room, sipping wine and judging romantic disputes like it's medieval reality TV. A knight claims his lady ignored his latest ballad. The lady counters that it wasn't even metrically correct. The court deliberates. The decision? He must compose a better verse and wear her token in battle. Case closed. Next. As the day progresses, you stumble through more attempts at Lovelace lyricism. You witness a young man sobbing dramatically under a window while plucking a lute with all the grace of a cat walking on a harp. You overhear two noble women critiquing a suitor's poem like it's a fashion disaster. He rhymed love with dove again. Unoriginal. You see a knight get slapped with a glove and immediately declare it a divine blessing from her most radiant hand. And honestly, you start to kind of love it. It's absurd, but it's sincere. These people are putting their hearts on the line, albeit in overstuffed syllables and weird metaphors involving falcons and bleeding roses. Of course, not all medieval love was this sanitized. Behind closed doors, things got messier, darker, and more complicated. Real marriages were often about land, power, and alliance. Real relationships, especially among peasants, were more practical and less poetic. But for a few glowing decades in a few glowing courts, chivalric romance became a kind of shared delusion. A cultural cosplay of longing, idealization, and heartbreak that left behind scrolls of really bad poetry and the occasional broken jousting lance. You end your day by writing your own love note, just to see if you can get the hang of it. It goes something like, "To she whose face is like the morning dew upon a turnip field, whose eyes mirror the blessed tarnish of holy pewter." Yeah, you're still terrible at this, but you tuck it into a carved wooden box anyway. Maybe someone in the future will find it and assume you are some great medieval lover instead of a confused time tourist with fish breath and a bleeding quill hand. As you settle in for the night, you hear a voice echoing outside, a knight shouting a verse to the stars about unrequited love and aching loins. You sigh, roll over, and wonder if tomorrow might be a bit less dramatic. It won't be. This is the Middle Ages, and love? It's a battlefield lined with badly written rhymes. The sun hasn't even cracked the sky yet, and already something's off. The air smells wrong, sweet, sharp, and a little like overripe apples that got into a fight with vinegar. You step outside and the street is quiet. Too quiet. Then, from behind you, a long, low clang of church bells. Not for celebration, but warning. People are gathering, muttering, avoiding eye contact. Something is coming. Something bad. No, not your love poetry from yesterday. Worse. It's plague season, baby. And tonight we're putting on our beaked masks, soaking our robes in herbs, and embracing the most terrifying fashion trend in medieval history, the bubonic plague party look. First things first, your outfit. You can't just wear your usual woolen tunic and hope for the best. No. You need armour, but not the shiny, sword-proof kind, the kind that'll protect you from the invisible enemy. Bad air. That's what they believed caused the plague. Miasma, stink, filth, odour-borne death. So naturally you don a long waxed coat, gloves, boots, and most importantly the famous plague doctor mask, that long hollow beak stuffed with herbs like lavender, mint and cloves. You look like a cross between a haunted pelican and a spice merchant with severe anxiety. You can barely see through the glass eye holes. Breathing is a nightmare. But you're ready to face the apocalypse in style. People clear the way when they see you, partly because you look terrifying, but also because your appearance screams, someone nearby is actively dying. And to be fair, they usually are. That's your job, to check on the sick, poke their buboes, and occasionally prescribe a mix of ground emerald and pigeon blood. Not super effective, but hey, it's the 1300s and the medical profession is basically winging it with a handful of herbs and a prayer. You make your rounds, and everywhere it's the same. Shuttered homes, red crosses on doors, families whispering last rites. You stop by a merchant's house where 3 out of 5 family members are already dead. You give the remaining 2 a sniff of rosemary and tell them to burn their bedding. Whether it works or not is anyone's guess, but you've done your duty. You walk back into the foggy street, beak mask trailing a faint whiff of time and desperation. Now here's the kicker. This terrifying get-up? It's not even medieval. That iconic plague doctor look didn't appear until the 17th century, way after the Black Death's first devastating wave in the 1340s. That's your quirky fact for the evening. The mask was likely invented by Charles Delorme, a physician who wanted to create a protective barrier for doctors dealing with outbreaks. So technically, if you're walking the streets of 1349 in this look, you're way ahead of your time. But don't worry, the fear you inspire is timeless. Back during the real peak of the Black Death, people didn't have beak masks. They had cloth soaked in vinegar, pockets full of posies, yes, like the rhyme, and a wide range of terrible medical advice. Some bled themselves with leeches, others burned incense or slaughtered animals in the streets, hoping to appease the divine, and some people danced. No, really. In certain towns, the fear of death turned into a kind of mass hysteria, where people began dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed, or worse. Historians are still debating whether this was a psychological response to trauma, an early form of social panic, or something even weirder. Which brings us to a darker question. Did any of this work? The answer mostly is no. The plague tore through Europe like a wildfire in a haystack, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Scholars still argue about the exact numbers and the true cause. We know it was likely spread by fleas on rats, or maybe just fleas on people, medieval hygiene being what it was. But even now, in the 21st century, the debate isn't fully settled. Some researchers point to multiple strains, others to an airborne component. The truth is still buried somewhere beneath layers of soot, bones, and myth. But let's shift from death to fashion again, because even in the face of total societal collapse, people still found ways to look the part. Funerals became theatrical, with processions and banners and weeping actors for hire. Mourning attire took on symbolic meaning, darker hoods, veils, and special cloaks. And in a strange, unsettling twist, some artists began depicting death not as a shadowy reaper, but as a skeletal figure in dance poses. Yes, the infamous danse macabre was born around this time. Art, music, and fashion collided into this bleakly fabulous vibe of, you're going to die, but at least make it memorable. You naturally lean into this aesthetic. You find yourself tying a black ribbon around your arm, etching a skull into your belt buckle, maybe even scribbling a morbid little poem into your notebook. Something like, though flesh shall rot and worms do dine, my cloak remains forever fine. It's the little things, and weirdly, you're not alone. Across Europe, plague culture seeps into every corner of life. There are plague saints like St. Sebastian, whose statues are suddenly popping up everywhere. There are charms, relics, holy water flasks worn like necklaces, and then there's you, stalking the streets in your menacing bird mask, scaring children and low-key enjoying the power trip. Don't lie, you love the drama. By dusk, the sky turns a soft grey, and the bells toll again. Another death. Another tally mark on the town ledger. You remove your mask for a moment, the scent of crushed herbs clinging to your face, and you wonder how people lived like this. How they managed day after day with so much loss, so little understanding, and such absurd rituals. But maybe that's the answer. Ritual. The masks, the incense, the scented pomanders weren't just for health. They were for control, for dignity, for the illusion of power in a world unravelling. And honestly, it worked. For a little while. Because even if you couldn't cure the plague, you could at least face it dressed like a cursed parrot. You trudge home, exhausted, mask in hand, cloak flapping in the wind like a shadow. Somewhere behind you, a child sneezes. You consider setting fire to everything you own. You wake up with the vague sense that today might involve violence. Not war, not an invasion, just the casual, legally sanctioned kind. Because tonight, you're learning how the Middle Ages settled disputes the old-fashioned way, trial by combat. That's right, someone accuses you of theft, witchcraft, or maybe just being weirdly good at poetry, and instead of a lengthy court battle, you're tossed into a muddy arena and told, good luck. Spoiler, you won't be lucky. You start the day with a summons. Someone claims you insulted their goat, or maybe their mother, who, in this case, is their goat. Either way, You've been called to defend your honour by violence. You try to protest, maybe offer a well-worded denial, but no one cares. Truth, in this moment, is irrelevant. The outcome of this brawl will literally determine whether you're guilty or innocent. Because according to medieval logic, God won't let the innocent lose. You look up at the sky, hoping for divine reassurance. The sky ignores you. You're led to a field just outside town. There's a crude wooden fence, a crowd gathering, and a man holding a very questionable chicken on a stick, possibly the local herald. You're given two choices, a dull sword and a small shield made of wood and something that smells like disappointment. Your opponent? Let's just say they look like they bench press oxen for fun. You, on the other hand, are pretty sure you pulled a hamstring trying to climb out of bed this morning. Trial by combat wasn't just a cinematic fantasy, it was real. From the 9th century through the late Middle Ages, especially in Germanic and Norman law, trial by combat was considered a legitimate legal proceeding. Nobles had the most dramatic versions, complete with full armour, horses, and an audience that treated it like the medieval Super Bowl. But the lower classes got in on it too, with significantly fewer rules and significantly more mud. You and your opponent are handed your weapons. The crowd cheers, or jeers, you can't quite tell. There's a man selling hot chestnuts, which feels a little disrespectful, but whatever. The herald shouts something vaguely Latin, and then you're off. Swing, duck, trip, swing again. There's no choreography here, no slow-motion duel on a cliffside. This is just two sweaty humans wildly flailing at each other until one taps out or taps into eternity. Your quirky fact for the night: combat wasn't always between men. Oh no! In rare but documented cases, women also participated in trial by combat, against men. But because that was considered an unfair matchup, gee thanks. The man had to fight from a waist-deep pit with one arm tied behind his back, while the woman could move freely with a club. Think about that. Some poor guy, accused by a woman, standing in a pit like a giant toddler in timeout, trying to swat her with his free hand while she circles him like a hawk with a grudge. Medieval fairness at its most chaotic. Back to you. You're panting, covered in bruises, maybe missing a tooth, but you're still standing. Your opponent is down, groaning something about injustice and needing a snack. The referee, a monk with a questionable understanding of medical science, declares you the victor. Congratulations. This legally means you were innocent the entire time. Not because of witnesses, not because of evidence, but because you hit the other guy harder. Justice is served. But not everyone loved this system. Over time, skepticism crept in. What if the stronger man was guilty? What if divine intervention had an off day? What if, crazy idea, the sword didn't know the truth? Legal scholars and clergymen began debating whether maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the best way to determine truth. The church especially started pushing for trials based on evidence and confessions, not blood and bruises. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many regions began phasing out trial by combat in favour of more traditional inquisitorial proceedings. Of course, some nobles kept the practice going because, well, when you own a castle, you get bored. Trial by combat was less about actual justice and more about the vibe. And let's be honest, nothing says my ego is fragile like settling an inheritance dispute by challenging your cousin to a duel with maces at dawn. As you limp away from the field, victorious and somehow still holding your sword backward, you start thinking about how trial by combat might look in the modern world. Picture two lawyers throwing hands outside a courthouse, a couple getting divorced settling custody over a mud wrestling match, a landlord and tenant battling over a clogged sink with pool noodles in front of a live audience. The possibilities are endless and ridiculous. But in the Middle Ages, this was deadly serious. Your life, your reputation, your entire family's future could hinge on how well you swung a sword, or how well your champion did, if you were rich enough to hire one. That's right. If you didn't feel like getting sweaty, you could pay someone to fight in your place. This, of course, led to a whole industry of trained duelists for hire, some of whom were less concerned with truth and more with payday. It's basically the medieval version of hiring a lawyer, if your lawyer was a 6'5" brawler with no front teeth and a deep hatred of ankles. By the end of the day, your arms are jelly, your face is half mud, and you've officially cleared your name through the power of barely controlled violence. The crowd disperses, mostly disappointed that no one lost an eye, and the herald ceremoniously hands you a loaf of bread and a mug of ale, your prize apparently. You sit on a stone wall, sip your drink, and look out over the town. Justice, as it turns out, isn't blind. It's just really into sword fights. Your bruises are still fresh, your pride moderately inflated, and your limbs feel like boiled cabbage, but there's no rest for the historically curious. Today, you're headed into the royal court, not as a knight or noble, but as something far riskier, much more dangerous. Tonight you're walking the tightrope between hilarity and execution as a medieval jester, trying not to make the wrong joke in front of the wrong person, and, die. You're handed a costume. It's something. Bright colours, bells on the sleeves and shoes, a hat with floppy points and more bells, because subtlety is illegal apparently. You look like a circus tent got into a bar fight with a rooster and lost. But here's the surprise, you're not a clown. Not really. You're a licensed professional court fool and you've got more political power than most of the courtiers flouncing around in fur. You just have to be funny enough to survive. The court is packed tonight. The nobles sip wine and try not to look bored. The king leans on one elbow, and the tension in the air is thicker than peasant stew. You step forward, bell-laden boots jingling ominously, and launch into your act. It starts safe. Some exaggerated miming, a pratfall, maybe an impression of the local bishop with a very large turnip. The crowd titters. Good. Now, you push your luck. You crack a joke about the Queen's hunting skills, specifically how the deer seem to die of embarrassment rather than her arrows. Laughter, nervous glances, a quiet oof from the corner. The Queen raises an eyebrow. Your life flashes before your eyes. But then, thank the blessed saints, she snorts. The room erupts. You live to jest another day. Here's the thing about jesters. They weren't just comic relief. They were sometimes the only people in court allowed to speak the truth, wrapped in enough sarcasm and slapstick to let it slide. You're walking a dangerous line. Say the wrong thing, get too clever with your observations, and suddenly you're missing, and nobody's quite sure what happened. But play your cards right, and you become indispensable. Not just funny, but wise. A kind of walking mirror, holding up the ridiculousness of the court and making everyone laugh just enough to forget they're being insulted. Your quirky fact for tonight. Some jesters held official ranks and even got paid in land. That's right. You could mock the nobility for a living and walk away with your own little manor house. There are even tales of jesters being consulted on military and political matters. Imagine that. A man in bells and mismatched shoes advising on war strategy. And being right. The most famous jesters, like Will Somers, who served Henry VIII, were both comedians and confidants. Somers reportedly survived the reigns of Henry VIII and 3 of his children, managing to keep his head both figuratively and literally, even when nobles were being executed for looking at the king sideways. He must have been a comedic genius, or had dirt on everyone. But there's scholarly debate about just how much power jesters really had. Were they truly immune to punishment, or just one misstep away from the dungeon like everyone else? Some historians argue that the fool's license was more myth than fact, and that most jesters lived in constant fear, always towing the line between entertainment and heresy. Others point out that jesters were often marginalised figures, outsiders, disabled individuals or foreigners, who were granted this strange role precisely because they didn't fit into the usual hierarchy. A dangerous freedom, perhaps, but freedom all the same. Back at court, you're shifting into your second act, a song badly sung but intentionally so. You strum a lute with 3 broken strings and rhyme privy with livery. A few nobles are red in the face, but the king is laughing so hard he spits wine down his beard. You're crushing it. Someone throws you a coin. Someone else throws a chicken bone. Both are compliments, probably. You use this moment to sneak in a political jab. Something about tax collectors having fingers longer than their ledgers. A risky move. The royal treasurer twitches. The room holds its breath. But the joke lands. Even the steward smirks. You're dancing through landmines and somehow making it look like ballet. It's not all laughs, though. Jesters are expected to entertain the sick, the bored, and sometimes the dying. You're called to the chamber of a young prince who hasn't smiled in weeks. You sit beside his bed, make a few faces, sing a soft tune about frogs and noblemen, and watch as a tiny smile creeps across his lips. It's a small moment, but it sticks with you. Comedy, even in this world of plagues and power plays, still matters. Later, in the quieter hours, you gather with other performers in the back of the hall. There's a fire, some leftover wine, and stories. Tales of jesters who overstepped, of kings who played favourites, of queens who laughed too hard and were never seen again. You sip your wine and keep the bells on your hat from jingling as you lean back and stare at the rafters, wondering how long your luck will last. You've survived your first full day as a court jester. You insulted half the nobility, flirted with the edge of execution, and somehow came out the other side with applause and a pocketful of dried fruit. You might be dressed like a walking accident, but tonight you are the sharpest mind in the room. Just don't forget, tomorrow you have to do it all over again, and the bar just got higher. You wake up to a rooster having an existential crisis outside your window. The bells on your jester hat are tangled in your hair, and your breath smells faintly of wine and fear. But today, you're not jesting. You're learning how to get dressed without being arrested. That's right. Today you're navigating the fashion minefield of sumptuary laws, those delightful medieval rules that told people what they could and could not wear, based on their social class, occupation, income, and general vibe. You slip out of bed and begin the daily ritual of choosing clothes that won't get you fined. Or worse, you eye the rich velvet tunic you borrowed from the court laundry pile. It's stunning. Deep blue, embroidered with gold thread, soft enough to make angels weep. It also screams someone's above their station. Wearing it could get you dragged into court, slapped with a fine that would bankrupt a village, and possibly accused of impersonating nobility. You sigh and reach for your scratchy wool backup tunic. Status, legally sad. Sumptuary laws were, in essence, social control dressed up as fashion policing. Starting as early as the 13th century and evolving well into the Renaissance, these laws told people what materials, colours and accessories they were allowed to wear. If you were a peasant, don't even think about silk. Merchants? You could maybe wear fur, but not the good kind. Nobility had exclusive rights to colours like purple and fabrics like ermine. If your outfit was too nice for your class, someone would absolutely rat you out. You head to the market square and see it playing out live. A merchant's wife is being scolded for wearing sleeves trimmed with squirrel fur. Squirrel! Not mink, not sable. Squirrel! But apparently that's still a few notches too fancy for her husband's income bracket. The town constable waves a scroll of regulations and makes her remove the offending garment right there in the street. You make intense eye contact with your own squirrel-trimmed gloves and slide them into your belt like they never existed. What's wild is how detailed these laws could be. In England, one statute actually specified that knights under the rank of baron could wear velvet in their doublets, but not in their cloaks. In Florence, a woman could be fined for wearing too many buttons. Yes, buttons. Because nothing says danger to society like excess fastening. And heaven help you if your shoes were too stylish. We're talking toe-length restrictions again. It's like a runway show, but judged by bureaucrats with personal grudges and a deep hatred for self-expression. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In 1363, King Edward III passed a particularly intense sumptuary law in England, aiming to curb excesses caused by the growing merchant class. The problem? Merchants were getting rich, and they wanted to dress like the nobles whose taxes they were probably paying. But this blurred the lines of social hierarchy, and the elite weren't about to let silk become basic. So Parliament basically said, "Poor people, stop looking cool, it's confusing." But did these laws actually work? That's the debate. Some scholars believe sumptuary laws were largely symbolic, more about reinforcing ideals than actual enforcement. Others argue they were very much enforced, especially in cities with strong guilds and civic pride. The real question is, why were people so obsessed with controlling clothing? The answer lies in fear. The fear of social mobility, of disruption, of peasants dressing like lords and lords being mistaken for merchants. In a rigidly stratified world, appearance was identity. And clothes were the loudest thing you could wear besides actual wealth. Of course, the laws were also wildly inconsistent. What counted as appropriate varied not just by class, but by profession, region, even marital status. Widow, you better be in black and modest enough to make a monk blush. Courtesan, you might be required to wear specific colours to distinguish yourself, because medieval society, in its infinite hypocrisy, loved labelling people but still wanted them visible for convenience. Your quirky fact tonight is a good one. Some towns even required prostitutes to wear specific hats, like a medieval version of the Scarlet Letter, except fashion-forward. In 14th century Venice, sex workers had to wear yellow scarves or gloves to identify their profession. But here's the twist. Eventually, wealthy women started wearing the same yellow accessories, Because they were fashionable. Cue absolute chaos. Imagine the town officials trying to figure out who was scandalous and who was just trendy. As you pass the tailor's shop, you hear an argument inside. A young apprentice is begging to add gold trim to a belt, and the master is shaking his head like he's being asked to commit treason. "Do you want to get flogged?" he hisses. You make a mental note. No gold belts, no buttons, no velvet cloaks, and definitely no purple. You've barely got the status for beige. But here's the most absurd part. Half the nobles didn't follow the laws themselves. Rich families flaunted them, knowing full well they could pay off any fines. It was the middle class and the poor who got caught in the net, punished not for actual crime but for ambition. A merchant tries to impress a lord by dressing up. Boom. Fined. A baker's daughter wears a silk veil to a feast. Her family might lose their stall. Sumptuary laws didn't protect morality. They protected privilege under the sparkling, itchy veil of decency. As evening falls, you retreat to your quarters, slipping off your neutral-toned outfit and shaking the dust from your more flamboyant pieces. The ones you want to wear but don't dare. You light a candle and sketch out an outfit in secret. Slash sleeves, cobalt blue, maybe even fur-lined cuffs. It's probably treasonous, but you don't care. Sometimes rebellion looks like fashion, and in a world where your clothes can get you fined, flogged or labelled immoral, maybe looking fabulous is the most dangerous thing you can do. So go on. Wear the squirrel gloves in private, just don't let the bishop see. You know what you need after getting verbally assaulted by a fashion law? A bath. A long, hot, aromatic soak to forget the trauma of squirrel fur legislation and button-counting tailors. And wouldn't you know it, tonight you're headed to one of the most unexpectedly social and frankly chaotic spots in medieval life, the public bathhouse. Get ready for steam, scandal, gossip, and a whole lot of communal nudity. You're escorted through narrow stone alleys, past vendors selling herbs and garlic sausages, until you arrive at a low building exhaling warm, fragrant air. Inside, it's a humid paradise. Candlelight flickers on wet stone walls, steam coils like ghostly ribbon around timber beams, and there's the soft, echoing murmur of voices, laughter and splashing. Someone sneezes. Someone else starts a lute solo. You're immediately overwhelmed, in the best way. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Not bad, just dense. A pungent stew of rosemary, lavender, mint, sweat, and damp wool towels that haven't been properly dried since Pentecost. Your attendant, a very stern woman named Gertrude who could break a barrel with one hand, tells you to strip and points to a small bench. You oblige, trying to maintain dignity while peeling off layers of linen like an onion of sadness. Modesty, optional, shame, useless. You're about to get very familiar with your neighbours. Public bathhouses were incredibly popular in medieval towns and cities, especially across the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France, Italy and England. For many people, it was the one place they could get properly clean more than once a season. You'd pay a small fee, get a towel, maybe, a bit of soap, if you're lucky, and access to a series of heated rooms. Dry rooms, wet rooms, hot pools, cold tubs. It's basically a medieval spa day, minus the calming music and plus a guy in the corner hacking up plague phlegm. You settle into a warm pool, water up to your collarbones, and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Across from you, a merchant is loudly discussing the price of oxen, while a monk hums something suspiciously bawdy under his breath. The bathhouse is a melting pot. Rich, poor, religious, secular, everyone mingling in various stages of undress. And they're not just here for hygiene. Oh no, the bathhouse is also a gossip hub, a date spot, a negotiation table, and, depending on the time and place, an unofficial brothel. Here's your quirky fact. In some cities, especially in Germany, couples used bathhouses like a medieval Tinder. You could go on a date in the tub. There were even couples packages, wine, sweet cakes, music. An aquatic romance experience complete with soft lighting and the faint stench of boiled armpit. In many towns, the line between bathhouse and bedroom was whisper thin, and officials spent an absurd amount of time writing up laws to try and separate the two. They failed. Spectacularly. Now the man next to you is offering beer. It's warm, herbal, and served in a carved wooden mug that smells like last week's onions, but it hits the spot. You clink mugs and toast to not having lice today. Across the pool, someone's pouring water over a friend's head while giving a half-serious sermon about moral cleanliness. There's laughter, a brief splash fight, and someone slips and falls dramatically, creating a wave that douses a very confused nun. No one's even mad, this is just Tuesday, but not everyone was a fan of these bathhouse shenanigans. As we enter the later Middle Ages, the church starts side-eyeing bathhouses hard. Too much skin, too much mixing, too much joy. Some clergy denounced them as dens of sin, places where virtue dissolved faster than a bar of imported soap. In response, reformers pushed for gender-segregated bathing and stricter regulations. The vibe shifted. In some towns, bathhouses became more private. In others, they disappeared entirely. Blame the rise of modesty culture, shifting urban planning, and, oh yeah, the plague. Because if there's one thing the Black Death didn't love, it was steamy rooms full of people breathing heavily. Still, there's scholarly debate about just how unhygienic the Middle Ages really were. While modern myths paint medieval people as filthy and allergic to soap, the reality is more complex. People did wash, some more regularly than others. In warmer regions and cities with Roman-influenced infrastructure, bathhouses were common and beloved. In colder climates, less so. But the idea that no one bathed ever, that's 19th century propaganda designed to make Victorians feel superior. Spoiler, the Victorians were gross in their own way. Back in the tub, Gertrude returns with a bar of what she calls soap, though it feels more like cheese and smells like ash. She scrubs you with the gentle force of a hurricane, and before you can protest, she's dunked you under like you're being baptized into the cult of cleanliness. When you resurface, blinking and gasping, you feel lighter, cleaner, slightly bruised. You finish your soak with a rinse of cold water that shocks you into a new personality. Someone hands you a towel with a hole in the middle, and you wrap it around yourself like a very underpaid Roman senator. You step outside into the cool evening air, skin steaming, hair plastered to your head, and for a moment you feel good. Not just physically clean, but emotionally scrubbed. Because in a world where death might knock on your door at any moment, a hot bath and some warm beer with strangers might just be the height of luxury. As you walk back to your quarters, the stars are out, the streets are quiet, and you're radiating heat like a human bread oven. Tomorrow will be chaos again. More trials, more rules, probably a feral goose. But tonight, you're clean, and that's enough. Just remember to hide those squirrel gloves again. You wake up to a sound that can only be described as wet thunder. It rumbles low, builds with alarming intensity, and finally bursts into a triumphant blast that echoes off the stone walls. A few seconds later, the scent follows. You sit up, blinking at the ceiling, and realise you're about to experience one of the strangest, most hilariously underappreciated forms of medieval entertainment. Professional flatulence. Yes, tonight you're meeting the heroes of the hall, the fart jesters, the gas minstrels, the artist of the arse. Strap in. It's going to be a windy ride. You shuffle downstairs into the great hall of a local manor, where benches are lined with townsfolk, nobles, and the mildly inebriated. The candles flicker, the ale flows, and all eyes turn to the low platform at the far end of the room. A hush falls. You're expecting a bard, maybe a fire eater. Instead, a short round man steps onto the stage, bows with theatrical flair, and lifts the hem of his tunic just slightly. What happens next is not subtle. With the practiced confidence of a man who's never known shame, he lets out a controlled, melodic toot that would make a trumpet blush. The crowd goes wild. You, meanwhile, are somewhere between horrified and impressed. And you're not alone, because this man, and others like him, were once highly sought-after entertainers in medieval courts. Their talents, bodily, their methods, mysterious, their fame, explosively earned. One of the most legendary of these performers was Roland the Farter, an English flatulist who lived during the 12th century and was so beloved by King Henry II that he was reportedly granted a manor and 30 acres of land in return for performing one jump, one whistle, and one fart every Christmas. Imagine getting paid in real estate to be the court's biological whoopee cushion. And yet, it happened. You lean in, curious, as tonight's performer begins his routine. It's not just random blasts, it's choreographed. There are rhythms, variations, even harmonies. He paces dramatically between bursts, working the crowd like a bard of bodily functions. At one point he imitates a horse, then a barking dog, and finally what he claims is the sound of a French knight retreating. That one gets a standing ovation. The crowd roars with laughter, slapping tables and wiping tears from their eyes. This isn't bathroom humour. Okay, it is. But it's also something deeper. A shared joy in absurdity. A reminder that even in a world ruled by plague and war and way too much salted fish, people could still laugh at the simplest, silliest things. And no matter how many sumptuary laws the nobility passed, nobody could regulate a fart. You chat with the performer after his set, and he's remarkably serious about his craft. He explains, between bites of pickled onion, that training takes years. Certain diets help control airflow. Posture and core strength are essential. Timing is everything. You nod solemnly, the way one does when hearing about the ancient art of fart for hire. He even claims to know men who can hit a perfect fifth with their sphincters. You're not sure if he's exaggerating or if you're just deeply unqualified to argue. Here's your quirky fact. Flatulence as performance wasn't unique to England. In Ireland, the medieval annals reference entertainers who specialised in bodily humour. Some Norse sagas mention men who used their acoustics to insult rivals in feasts. The practice likely goes back even further, to Roman times, when Emperor Elagabalus allegedly held contest for the most impressive flatulence. Though, as with most things Elagabalus did, we're not entirely sure whether to believe it or cry. Of course, not everyone appreciated this particular brand of art. There was pushback. Some clergymen denounced farting performances as vulgar, sinful, or evidence of moral collapse. But honestly, what didn't they think was morally collapsing? These are the same guys who once banned laughing in church. Naturally, the more the church scolded, the more popular flatulists became among the people. It's a tale as old as time. Tell folks not to laugh and they'll bring in a guy who can make fart sounds in iambic pentameter. There's a scholarly debate around how widespread and accepted these performers truly were. Were they common fixtures at feasts or rare novelties? Were they honoured artists or tolerated jesters? The records are patchy. After all, medieval scribes weren't always eager to write down the details of someone's wind solos. But the surviving references, especially from England and France, suggest they were more than just sideshow oddities. They were part of the culture, the comedy, the weird, wonderful tapestry of medieval entertainment. Back in the Great Hall, the party's in full swing. Musicians play something lively, dancers kick up their skirts, and someone passes you a tankard of cider that smells like it's been blessed by a drunk druid. You're still trying to wrap your head around the idea that people once owned land because they were really, really good at farting on command. And that's the charm of it, the sheer ridiculousness. In a time when most people lived short, brutal lives filled with cold winters, bad teeth, and far too much boiled cabbage, laughter was sacred. It didn't have to be clever, it just had to be shared. And if that meant giving a man with a strong gut and poor impulse control 30 acres of farmland, well, so be it. You head out into the night, your ribs sore from laughter, the echo of the last musical fart still ringing in your ears. There's something comforting in the knowledge that the Middle Ages, with all their grim realities, also made space for joy, silliness, and human noise in its purest, most ridiculous form. You take a deep breath, you exhale, you pause, and then, just to see if you've learned anything from tonight, you try a little toot of your own. It's weak, pitiful even. You're no Roland. You wake up giggling, probably from dreams of medieval fart concerts, but your joy is short-lived. Outside your window, the church bells are tolling in an odd, frantic rhythm, and down in the street something's not right. It's not the usual morning bustle. No carts creaking, no hawkers yelling about eels, just drums and feet. So many feet. You peek outside and immediately regret it. The town square is filled with dozens of people, spinning, hopping and flailing to a rhythm no one else can hear. You squint. Is that the town butcher doing a cartwheel? The midwife trying to tango with a goat? Congratulations. You've woken up in the middle of a dancing plague. You rush downstairs, pulling on your boots and trying not to trip over your own panic. The scene in the square is surreal. Like someone threw a wedding, forgot the band, and then possessed everyone with the ghost of interpretive dance. Men and women, young and old, all moving in a chaotic, sweaty blur. Some are laughing, some crying, some look completely vacant, as if they're not even here, and they just won't stop. You flag down a passing monk who looks mildly distressed and ask what's going on. He shrugs in total exasperation and says, "It's St. Vitus again." Right. Of course, because when things get weird in the Middle Ages, it's either the devil, God, or a saint with a grudge. The dancing plague wasn't a one-time event. It happened multiple times throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The most famous outbreak was in 1518 in Strasbourg, modern-day France, where dozens of people danced in the streets, uncontrollably, for days. Eyewitnesses describe people collapsing from exhaustion, foaming at the mouth, even dying from heart attacks and strokes, all while dancing. It sounds absurd, but it really happened, and no one knew why. Back in your village, you're watching the town baker do a violent version of the worm while screaming something about St. Elmo's fire. A group of friars tries to calm the crowd with hymns, but that just seems to make the dancers more enthusiastic. You dodge a spinning blacksmith and duck behind a barrel. You're not ready to be spiritually jazzercised to death. Eventually you find the town healer, an older woman with about 3 teeth and a pouch full of dried toads, and she's already brewing a potion that smells like regret and cabbage. She mutters about overheated blood, excessive melancholy, and possibly demon-infested wheat. You blink. Demon wheat? Here's your quirky fact of the night. One modern theory is that some of these dancing plagues might have been caused by ergot, a fungus that grows on damp rye and produces chemicals similar to LSD. So, if your village's bread supply got mouldy enough, the entire town might start tripping hard, and the hallucinations, spasms, and frantic movement could look like dancing, or witchcraft, or divine punishment. Take your pick. But that's just one theory. Others suggest mass psychogenic illness, essentially a group mental health crisis, sparked by stress, trauma, and poor living conditions. Think of it like a contagious anxiety attack, but with choreography. Some scholars even propose it was an elaborate form of protest or a social ritual gone wrong. The truth? We still don't know. The debates rage on. One thing's for sure, something about medieval life made people prone to dancing until they dropped dead. You find yourself drawn into the rhythm. Someone grabs your arm, an old man whose eyes are rolled back like he's seeing heaven in a flute solo, and suddenly you're spinning in a circle. Your feet move without permission. The drums, wherever they're coming from, are pulsing in your bones. You try to stop. You can't. Your heart races, sweat pours down your back, and your lungs burn like you've just run from a horde of Viking tax collectors. Thankfully, before you fully spiral into medieval Zumba hell, a pair of nuns drag you out of the crowd and force you to sit on a cold stone bench. They give you a cloth soaked in rosewater and start praying very loudly in Latin. You're too dizzy to argue. One of them says the town bishop is preparing a countermeasure, a holy dance floor. Yes, really. They're going to build a stage for the dancers, bring in musicians, and hope that if the afflicted get to shake it out in a controlled environment, they'll calm down. It's part exorcism, part street performance, and 100% medieval logic. You watch from the sidelines as workers throw down planks, raise garlands, and bring out flutes, fiddles, and drums. The dancers, relentless, drenched, wild-eyed, begin to climb onto the new platform, and somehow, as the music shifts from chaotic to melodic, something changes. Their movements slow, some collapse, some cry. A few continue on, as if chasing a rhythm only they can feel, but it's better, less manic, like the fever is breaking. You lean back, exhausted just from watching, and sip from a clay cup filled with something called nerve wine. It tastes like vinegar and old socks, but at this point, you'll drink anything if it promises to keep your limbs from involuntarily moonwalking. The sun sets on a strange, haunting scene. Bodies sprawled on the stage, the music fading, and the townspeople slowly recovering from a dance they never meant to join. You stumble back to your lodgings, shoes worn thin, heart still drumming in your chest. You pass a group of children trying to imitate the dancers, giggling and spinning in circles, unaware that today their town nearly rhythmed itself into a mass grave. You pause and wonder what it says about the human psyche, that even in the face of fear, hunger, pestilence, and relentless uncertainty, our bodies sometimes just dance. It's terrifying, and weirdly beautiful, and deeply, deeply medieval. And you fall into bed, the ghost of drums still echoing in your skull, and whisper to no one in particular, "Saint Vitus, please let tomorrow be boring." You wake up sore in places you didn't even know existed. Your legs ache from yesterday's accidental cardio death rave, and your ribs hurt, either from all the laughing or the nun who elbowed you when you tried to escape the prayer circle. Either way, you feel like someone beat you with a rosary, but there's no time to wallow, because today you're getting dressed for penance, not for fashion, not for flirtation. Today, you're trying on one of the itchiest, most soul-shriveling garments in medieval history, the hair shirt. Now, to be clear, you didn't sin that badly. You haven't, say, stolen from the altar or made off with a bishop's cheese wheel. But in the Middle Ages, sin wasn't just about what you did, it was about what you thought. Wanton thoughts, jealous feelings, slothful mornings in bed, all of that could send you down the slippery slope to eternal fire. And what better way to say, "I'm sorry" to God than by scraping your flesh raw under your tunic? A hair shirt, in case you've never had the pleasure, is exactly what it sounds like. A shirt made from coarse, stiff animal hair, often goat or horse, and worn next to the skin. It's like wearing a steel wool sweater over a sunburn. Every movement chafes, every breath rubs it in. You step into one that's been loaned to you by a travelling penitent, and the moment it touches your back, you're pretty sure you've aged 10 years and lost the will to gossip forever. You wander into the village chapel, hair shirt scratching like it has a personal vendetta, and find a group of fellow penitents kneeling in silent suffering. Some of them have ropes around their waists. One guy's wearing a crown of thorns, not the fancy gold kind, the real kind. You nod respectfully and try not to scream. The monk leading the group gestures for you to sit. You do. Bad idea. Sitting increases the shirt's contact points by 100%. You start bargaining with God in your head. Hair shirts were often worn as a form of voluntary penance, self-inflicted discomfort to show humility, discipline and remorse. Saints wore them, hermits wore them, reformed sinners wore them. Some people even slept in them. They were part of a wider trend of medieval asceticism, the belief that physical suffering could purify the soul, pain as prayer, discomfort as devotion. Because nothing says, "I love you, God," like giving yourself a rash that could take down a small village. Here's your historical fact of the night. St. Thomas Becket, yes, the famously murdered Archbishop of Canterbury, was found after his death to be wearing a hair shirt beneath his elaborate clerical robes. And not just any hair shirt, a lice-infested, sweat-soaked, years-old version that made his canonization basically automatic. Because in the medieval mindset, willingly choosing suffering, especially under layers of public dignity, was the fast track to sainthood. You try to focus on the monk's lesson about humility and redemption, but your brain has been hijacked by the sensation of wearing a porcupine dipped in vinegar. You start shifting, just slightly. Maybe a small scratch? Nope. The woman next to you gives you a look that could turn a troll to stone. You resume suffering in silence. But here's your quirky fact. Hair shirts weren't always limited to the deeply devout. Sometimes they were punishments, handed down by church authorities. Caught committing adultery, you might be forced to wear a hair shirt and walk through town barefoot with everyone watching. Lie to a priest? Hair shirt time. Occasionally nobles even use them in wills, asking that their bodies be buried in haircloth instead of silk, to prove their humility at the very last moment. Because nothing says eternal peace like eternal itching. The real debate, though, is how widespread this practice actually was. Scholars disagree. Was it reserved for elite religious figures and dramatics-inclined hermits? Or did everyday folks willingly subject themselves to it? Some sources suggest it was more symbolic than standard, more of a statement than a lifestyle. But monastic rules, letters, and the ever-dramatic writings of penitents themselves tell us this wasn't rare. For some, the hair shirt was part of a regular devotional routine. For others, it was punishment. And for a small, intense group, it was a lifestyle. A scratchy, miserable lifestyle. After what feels like 4 hours, but is probably 20 minutes, the session ends. The monk dismisses the group with a benediction and a knowing glance, as if to say, "You'll feel worse tomorrow." You stand up slowly, like a man trying not to burst into flames. The other penitents file out silently. One of them grins at you. It's not friendly. It's the grin of someone who's been itchy for decades and wants you to join their cult. You shuffle out into the daylight, eyes blinking against the sun, and immediately head for the river. Not to bathe, just to stand waist deep and let the cold water lull your skin into forgetting the textile torture you just endured. A duck swims past you, unimpressed. Somewhere upstream, children are throwing rocks and laughing. You stare at them, bitterly envious of their unchafed lives. As the sun dips low, you finally peel off the shirt. Your skin is raw, red, and full of regrets. But weirdly, there's a kind of relief in it. Not because you feel closer to heaven or anything noble like that, but because you did something hard, ridiculous, and deeply medieval, and survived. You wring out the hair shirt and hang it on a branch to dry just in case you ever feel like being humble again. You probably won't. But still, it's there, looming, like a goat hair conscience. You trudge back to your room wrapped in a blanket, hoping tomorrow's outfit involves fewer bodily rashes and more velvet. But somehow you suspect it won't. It's early morning, and your back still feels like it's been exfoliated by a furious porcupine with abandonment issues. The memory of yesterday's hair shirt haunts you. Every movement reminds you of the itchy horror you voluntarily wrapped yourself in like a penance burrito. But today, thank the saints, you're finally stepping into a trend that doesn't chafe, chomp, or spiritually unhinge you. In fact, it's kind of majestic. Today, you're diving headfirst, literally, into one of the most charmingly absurd medieval obsessions, falconry. You stroll into the training fields behind the manor, where the sky's a cool sweep of pale blue, and the trees are dotted with birds that aren't pigeons, which already feels fancy. Perched on stands and gloved arms are hawks, falcons, kestrels, even the occasional eagle, looking regal, bloodthirsty and slightly annoyed. You approach a falconer, a wiry man with permanent glove tan and a deep love for birds that scream. He sizes you up and hands you a thick leather glove. "Don't flinch," he says ominously. "They can smell fear." You nod solemnly and immediately flinch. Your assigned bird is a peregrine falcon named Agnes. She's got a beak like a sickle, eyes like a judge, and talons that say, "I could end you." The falconer places her on your arm, and suddenly you're carrying a feathery bundle of fury and nobility that weighs about as much as a small watermelon, but with 10 times the attitude. Falconry wasn't just a hobby in the Middle Ages, it was a whole social language. There were strict rules about who could own which birds. Kings had eagles and gyrfalcons, nobles got peregrines and goshawks, clergy might carry sparrowhawks, and peasants? Maybe they could borrow a bird-shaped rock, but you, for reasons no one questions, you've been given a falcon, and now you're in the exclusive club of medieval bird handlers. Congratulations, you're officially fancy. Now let's be clear, falconry is not just about owning a bird and hoping it comes back after lunch. It's an elaborate high-maintenance lifestyle. Training a bird of prey involves months of bonding, repetitive hand signals, bits of meat as rewards, and no small amount of getting pecked. You spend the morning learning the basics. How to tie the jessies, those leather straps that go around the bird's ankles, how to hood the bird, to keep it calm, not to make it look cool though it does, and how to whistle just right so she doesn't ghost you mid-flight. You walk through the meadow with Agnes on your arm, her sharp claws digging slightly through the glove, her head tilting at every rustle in the grass. She's focused, intense. Meanwhile, you're sweating through your tunic because the idea of her flying off and not coming back feels personally devastating. You're not ready for this bird to abandon you. You've just started making eye contact. And then, release. With a graceful movement, you raise your arm, loosen the jesses, and Agnes takes off like an arrow with wings. You gasp. The falconer nods approvingly. The sky becomes a blur of feathers and silent calculation as she ascends, circles, then dives with surgical precision. Somewhere in the distance, a rabbit's life comes to an abrupt feathered end. Nature, 1. Rabbit, very much 0. Here's your historical fact. Falconry dates back thousands of years, but in medieval Europe it became a cultural status symbol. Entire books were written about it, manuals on breeding, training and bird etiquette. Monarchs employed teams of falconers. There were travelling falconry schools, tournaments, even matchmaking, because nothing says eligible bachelor like showing up to a feast with a killer bird on your wrist. And if you think this is all just noble posturing, here's your quirky fact. Some falcons were given tiny hoods made of embroidered silk and velvet. That's right. Birds had better accessories than most peasants. They were transported in decorated boxes, fed carefully curated diets, and occasionally received more medical attention than actual people. In at least one record, a falcon was treated with a warm poultice and chicken broth, while the falconer's assistant died of untreated pneumonia in the background. Priorities. As the day progresses, you get better. Agnes seems to tolerate you. You learn how to whistle without sounding like a boiling kettle, and you only get pecked once. You talk to her too. Tell her your secrets. Ask her for advice. She offers none. She's a creature of sky and meat, and she doesn't care about your unresolved romantic entanglements or your very itchy spiritual crisis from yesterday. But there's a darker side to all this too. Falconry was expensive. Like ruin your family lineage expensive. Birds had to be fed meat daily, trained constantly, and watched obsessively to prevent escape. They were political tools, offered as gifts between kings and dukes. Losing a prized bird wasn't just a bad day. It could be a diplomatic incident. In some cases, stealing a falcon was punishable by death. So when Agnes circles a bit too far after her third flight, your heart momentarily stops. You call, you whistle, you panic, and then, there she is, swooping down like a war goddess, landing on your arm with a triumphant screech. You nearly cry. She just wants her snack. There's scholarly debate about how common falconry really was among the middle and lower classes. While the nobility's obsession is well documented, the further down the social ladder you go, the more rare, and likely illegal, it becomes. Some argue that falconry was occasionally practiced on the sly by ambitious merchants or lower clergy, but it's hard to prove. Most records are written by people with money, land, and a strong opinion about the superiority of the goshawk. As the sun sets, you walk back to the manor with Agnes dozing gently on your arm, feathers rustling like silk. You feel powerful, refined, only slightly bird-pooped. The other falconers nod at you like you've passed some unspoken test. You smile, imagining what it would be like to ride into town with your bird perched dramatically on your shoulder, just daring someone to mess with you. Because in this world, sword or no sword, you're not defenceless anymore. You have a falcon. Tomorrow you'll probably be covered in soot or exiled for eating the wrong cheese, but tonight you are noble, dignified, feather-adjacent, and honestly, Agnes kind of likes you. You wake to the distant clang of church bells and the soft crackling of a fire. It's not yours. Your room has no fire. That sound is coming from outside, where someone's house is probably burning down again because medieval architecture is mostly sticks, straw, and let's hope. You sit up groggily, eyes crusted with sleep and a feather stuck to your cheek. Thank you, Agnes. But today isn't about birds or fashion crimes or involuntary dance-offs. No, today you're tackling a real medieval mystery. Time. Or more specifically, how in the name of Saint baffled people managed to tell time in a world where clocks barely existed. Sunlight was optional, and mid-morning could mean anything from 7 a.m. to lunch. Your first challenge? Figuring out when to start the day. The sun's up, but barely. No wristwatch, no phone screen, just vibes. You wander into the village and notice a few people squinting at the sky, like it owes them money. Eventually a monk rings the bell at the chapel, signalling prime, the first canonical hour of the day. You try to translate that into modern time and land somewhere between early and give me another hour. But here in the Middle Ages, time isn't divided by consistent logical hours. It's divided by prayers. You're not measuring by the sun, you're measuring by salvation. You shuffle past the local smithy and catch sight of something glorious. A candle clock. Yes, a literal candle, notched with lines, each mark representing a set unit of time, usually 15 minutes to an hour depending on how fast it burns. Ingenious, ridiculous, and 100% flammable. You watch as a boy sets the candle inside a small wooden frame, then lights it with a shaky hand. One notch melts, time passes, another notch, and then a gust of wind blows the entire thing out. Well, there goes half the morning. Candle clocks weren't the only option. You also had sundials, useless on cloudy days, of which there are many. Water clocks, fussy, messy, and limited to places with actual plumbing, which is rare. Hourglasses, great for timing sermons or boiling cabbage, less great for managing a kingdom. And if you lived near a monastery, you could follow the divine office, that rigid schedule of 8 prayer services throughout the day and night. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, each one marked by the tolling of bells, which is helpful unless the bell ringer is asleep, drunk, or dead. All 3 are likely. You visit the local scribe, who seems to keep to a more refined time system. He's tracking the hours by oil lamp. Each lamp burns for about 2 hours, and he has a little chart scratched into the side of his desk, noting how many he's lit and extinguished. Crude, but accurate, he says proudly, then sneezes into the lamp and knocks it over. Time, ruined again. Here's your historical fact. Mechanical clocks did exist in the late Middle Ages, but they were rare, expensive, and wildly unreliable. The first known mechanical clock appears in the 13th century, likely in a European monastery. These early devices didn't even have hands. They just rang bells at intervals to mark the canonical hours. By the 14th century, clock towers began to appear in towns and cities, but owning a personal clock? Forget it. That's luxury beyond comprehension. You're more likely to own a chicken that tells time by screaming at dawn. Still, the obsession with time was real. Monks meticulously tracked the hours for prayer, scribes needed it to copy text accurately. Farmers followed natural cues like rooster crows, dew levels and gut instinct. Your body knew what time it was even if you didn't. Hunger? That's noon. Shadows pointing east. Time to pay taxes. Someone yelling about wheat theft in the square. Probably close to dinner. Here's your quirky fact. In Japan, they actually developed temporal hours, where an hour lasted longer in summer and shorter in winter to match daylight. Europe flirted with similar ideas, but generally stuck to inconsistent divisions of day and night. 12 hours each, no matter how long or short the sunlight lasted. That meant an hour in summer might be 75 minutes long, and in winter, maybe 45. No wonder everyone was late to everything. There's some scholarly debate about how much the average medieval person cared about time in the abstract sense. Some historians argue that peasants lived largely by natural rhythms, planting seasons, sunrise, and the sound of stomachs growling. Others say that even farmers were deeply aware of passing hours, especially once religious orders began dominating village life with their bell-scheduled routines. It wasn't clock time as we know it, but it was a kind of structured awareness that shaped everything from meal prep to marriage proposals. You wander into a tavern just as the innkeeper pulls a roasted duck out of the hearth and declares it sex dish, referring not to anything spicy, but to the 6th canonical hour, roughly noon. You grab a stool and ask how she keeps track. She gestures to a line of candles, a badly dented hourglass, and a massive rooster who, she claims, crows exactly 7 times a day. Never wrong, she says proudly. The rooster pecks her foot, except when he is. You spend the rest of the afternoon visiting locals with their own methods. One woman times her chores by song. 6 verses of a hymn for washing, 4 for kneading bread. A shepherd uses shadow lengths on a rock near the field. A drunk in the alley says he can smell when it's about to rain, which isn't helpful, but definitely on brand. You begin to realise that medieval time wasn't rigid. It was personal, fluid, messy, spiritual, wildly unrepeatable, and, ironically, kind of relaxing. You return to your room at evening-ish, light your own candle clock just for fun, and watch the flame devour time in a slow, flickering dance. You wonder what it would be like to live like this permanently. No buzzing phones, no digital clocks, no alarms screaming at 6 a.m, just bells, birds, and gut feelings. Maybe it would drive you mad, or maybe you'd finally sleep through the night. The candle burns down, 1 notch, then another. Time apparently keeps moving, even if no one agrees on what it actually is. You wake up to a high-pitched whinny, followed by what sounds like hooves clicking in a very intentional way, like someone trying to walk dramatically on cobblestone. You sit up, rub your eyes, and peek through the shutter. Yep, that's a horse in the courtyard, wearing a velvet cap, and what looks suspiciously like a medal. You squint. Is it wearing spurs? Welcome to your next medieval absurdity, one so over the top you almost have to respect it. Today, you're attending the knighting of a horse. Yes, really, because when humans aren't enough for chivalric drama, you throw a saddle on a legend and call him Sir Nays a lot. You make your way to the manor's training field, where half the village has gathered. Some are here for the ceremony. Most are here for the free ale and the chance to see if the horse will bow or kick someone. In the centre of it all stands the star of the show, a massive, muscled destrier named Roland. He's wearing ornate tack, a fringed cloth emblazoned with a family crest, and a look of absolute disdain. He knows he's the main character, and frankly he's earned it. A knight, grizzled, bearded, and clearly trying not to cry, steps forward. This is his warhorse, his battlefield companion, his 4-legged therapist. He begins the speech. It's long, poetic. He talks about how Roland saved his life in a skirmish, how he once kicked an enemy into a river, and how he's truer of heart than any man I've served beside. The crowd nods. A bard wipes away a tear. You silently agree. That horse could be king. Now let's pause here for your historical fact of the night. There were indeed horses who received honours in the medieval period, though whether they were officially knighted or just given honorary status is up for debate. The ceremony varied, but in some instances elite warhorses were draped in ceremonial cloths, blessed by clergy, or even given names and titles. In rare cases, chroniclers did record animals as full participants in battle, described not just as mounts, but as heroes in their own right. And while most knighting stories are probably exaggerated or symbolic, they reflect just how deeply people valued these animals. After all, warhorses weren't just transportation, they were weapons, trained to charge, trample and bite. Yes, bite. These steeds were bred and trained for years. A good destrier could make the difference between a glorious victory and a very fast death. They were expensive, rare, and often treated better than some human soldiers. So if a knight wanted to throw a little ceremony, a few oats, and a knighthood at his most loyal companion, no one was stopping him, especially not Roland. Now comes the big moment. The knight draws his sword, holds it aloft and gently taps the horse's withers. "Arise, Sir Roland," he says. The crowd erupts in cheers. Someone tosses flower petals. A lute player strikes up a ballad called The Ballad of the Bravest Bridle. A stable boy faints. You're watching a horse get inducted into the chivalric code. It's absurd. It's beautiful. It's peak medieval. Here's your quirky fact. In a few cases, noble animals were buried with honours. Tombs, inscriptions, even miniature shrines. In Eastern traditions, horses were often sacrificed or commemorated after death. In Europe, while less dramatic, there are accounts of warhorses being blessed, mourned and written into family histories. There's even a 15th century English record that lists a horse as a beneficiary in a will, granted pasture, feed and a retirement without labour. That's right, early medieval pension plan for a horse. But not everyone loved the idea. There were those, mostly from the more humorless corners of the clergy, who thought honouring animals this way was dangerously close to idolatry. Man is made in God's image, they'd say. Horses are for riding, not reverence. Of course, those guys usually got ignored, especially when Roland was around to stomp disapproval into the mud. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether stories like these reflect actual ceremonies or are literary devices meant to elevate the tales of great knights. But either way, they reveal something very real. People cared, deeply, often more than made sense. After the ceremony, Roland is led to a feasting table. Not kidding, someone laid out a tray of apples, carrots and a hay bale shaped like a crown. A local brewer raises a tankard and shouts, "To Sir Roland, may his hooves always strike true." You raise your mug too, because when a horse gets knighted, you respect the process. You wander over and try to pet him. He stares at you. You freeze. He snorts and allows it. Briefly, you've been accepted. The stable master leans over and whispers, "Don't touch the ears." That's his line. You nod. This is his day, not yours. The knight, visibly tipsy now, begins to recite poems about Roland's bravery. One involves a siege, another features an enemy being trampled so hard he sang like a lute. A small choir joins in. You lose track of how many songs involve horses defeating bandits. At one point, a very old lady insists she once saw Roland kick a ghost. Everyone claps. The sun begins to set, casting golden light over the field. Roland is escorted back to the stables like royalty, his blanket glittering with embroidery, his steps as slow and deliberate as a king walking through his court. You realise something important. In a world full of violence, plague and poorly cooked turnips, sometimes you need to knight a horse just to feel something. Back in your room, you scratch your head and ask yourself, why does this actually make sense? And it hits you. Chivalry isn't just about swordplay or honour duels. It's about loyalty, service, courage. And no one embodies that more purely than a warhorse who ran headfirst into battle because someone they trusted asked them to. So tonight, raise a glass to Sir Roland. Knight, beast, legend. May his oats be warm, his saddle soft and his tail forever unbothered. You awake the next morning with straw in your hair, a hoof print on your boot, and a lingering sense of awe from Sir Roland's majestic knighting. It's a high bar to follow, but today's journey will bring you somewhere just as unforgettable, though considerably less noble. You're heading into the world of medieval medical diagnostics, where diseases are diagnosed by colour, fate is foretold through fluids, and you're about to become intimately familiar with one of the weirdest, most revered tools in all of history, the urine flask. You start the day in the apothecary's hut, a cramped, musty little room that smells like boiling cabbage, burnt sage, and possibly feet. Shelves line the walls, cluttered with jars of dried herbs, vials of suspicious goo, and the occasional pickled rat. A wooden table holds a mortar and pestle that looks like it's seen some things, and in the corner stands a large basket labelled samples. You're trying not to read too much into that. Then the physician enters. And not just any physician. This one's got layers. He's wearing the long robe, the pointed hat, the elaborate belt full of pouches and instruments, and the unmistakable air of someone who's about to ask you to pee in something without making eye contact. He gestures toward the table and says, "Please provide a sample for diagnosis." You blink. He hands you a small, clear glass flask. You sigh. The medieval practice of uroscopy, diagnosing illness by examining a patient's urine, was as common as it was weirdly specific. Doctors would collect urine in specially shaped glass bottles and then analyse it for colour, clarity, smell, and occasionally taste. Yes, taste. You try not to gag as you hand over the warm, now awkwardly glowing flask and take a respectful step back. The physician holds it up to the light like a jeweller inspecting a gem. He squints, tilts it, swirls it, then he sniffs it, hard. He nods solemnly and turns to you. You have an excess of yellow bile, a wandering spleen, and... He pauses for dramatic effect. Your humours are slightly rebellious. You nod like that means anything. In medieval medicine, everything was about humours, not the funny kind, unfortunately, but the 4 bodily fluids believed to govern health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your humours were out of balance. Too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. It was less about germs and more about vibes, and nothing gave away your inner vibe more than your pee. The physician consults a colour chart, an actual reference tool in many medical texts of the time. It shows 20 shades of urine, ranging from cloudy like sheep's milk to black as night. He runs his finger down to lightly golden with foamy sediment and gasps. "You are in transition," he whispers. You feel like you've just been diagnosed with becoming a butterfly. Here's your historical fact. Physicians often travelled with urine charts and flasks tucked into satchels for house calls. Uroscopy was considered so important that it could be taught even to people with limited training. Some midwives and monks learned it. Apothecaries too. And if you couldn't afford a doctor, you could take your flask to the local herbalist, who'd give it a sniff and a guess. Sometimes it was even used for matchmaking. If your intended's pee looked off, maybe don't go through with the wedding. And it wasn't all superstition. As much as we like to laugh at medieval medical practices, some diagnoses based on urine were surprisingly accurate. Colour and clarity do reveal things. Dehydration, liver trouble, kidney issues. Medieval doctors may have lacked microscopes, but their senses were finely tuned. One whiff of something sulphurous, and they'd be prescribing boiled nettles and an exorcism in no time. But here's your quirky fact of the day. Some doctors used urine flasks as visual branding. Physicians would hang a little glass flask from their belts, like a modern stethoscope, to let people know they were legit. It was basically a medieval medical badge letting everyone know, I sniff things for science. In fact, the symbol of a flask full of golden liquid became so associated with doctors that it appears in paintings, carvings, and even on shop signs. Though you can imagine the confusion when people mistook it for a tavern logo. The day unfolds with you shadowing the physician. Patient after patient arrives, each with a flask, each one more confusing than the last. A farmer with cloudy blue-tinged urine is diagnosed with melancholy of the kidneys. A baker with bubbling yellow froth is told to avoid onions and stop thinking lustful thoughts. A child's sample, nearly clear, earns a delighted clap. This child, the physician announces, has excellent digestion and a future in the clergy. The mother swoons. There's scholarly debate, of course, about how seriously all of this was taken. Some argue that uroscopy was more ritual than science, a kind of performance medicine where the physician reinforced social roles through impressive-sounding diagnoses. Others insist that despite the lack of microbiology, many uroscopists genuinely tried to make sense of the body using whatever tools they had. And let's be honest, if your alternative is leeches or bloodletting, a urine consultation suddenly sounds kind of progressive. By sunset, you're exhausted, slightly dehydrated, and deeply unnerved by how many bodily fluids you've witnessed in open containers. The physician thanks you for your assistance and offers you a reward, a small leather-bound notebook titled On the Purity and Clarity of Waters. You nod, thank him politely, and immediately shove it to the bottom of your satchel. You walk home under a soft indigo sky, passing a group of children playing with a goat and a barrel. Somewhere a bell rings for vespers. You think about how far medicine has come, and how far it still has to go. Because in the end, you realise something important. Medieval medicine may have been messy, strange, and full of unearned confidence, but at least they were trying. And sometimes, the best diagnosis is just someone taking the time to look, listen, and say, yes, I believe something's wrong, and I want to help. Even if it means sniffing your pee, you've seen some things, you've sniffed some things, and after yesterday's deep dive into medieval uroscopy, you were fully prepared to have a quiet, uneventful morning filled with maybe a light porridge and a moment of peace. But peace, it turns out, is not on the menu, because today you're exploring one of the loudest, rudest, and most delightfully petty corners of medieval life. That's right. Welcome to the world of medieval graffiti, where walls were the internet, scribes were savages, and everyone had something to say. You start your day walking through the local abbey, which on the surface is a holy and serene place. Sunlight filters in through stained glass windows. Monks chant softly in the distance. Everything smells like incense and barely concealed judgment. But as you pass through the library cloister, you notice something odd. On the wooden desk where one monk is copying a religious manuscript, there's a faint carving, a name, then another, then a caricature. You lean closer. Is that a monk riding a goose? Yes. Yes, it is. Medieval graffiti wasn't just "I was here" scribbles in a bathroom stall. It was everywhere, scratched into church pews, carved into castle walls, inked in the margins of books. It was an entire underground culture of commentary, jokes, confessions, passive-aggressive jabs and artistic outbursts that somehow survived hundreds of years. You're not just looking at idle doodles, you're looking at the real voices of the past, and they are hilarious. In one corner of the chapel you find an ancient wooden beam with a Latin phrase burned into it with a hot iron nail. Omnia vanitas. Everything is vanity. Deep. Philosophical. You feel moved. Then, directly below it, someone added, "except beer." Same handwriting, probably not. Same energy, definitely. You head over to the town's church where the stonemason lets you examine the bell tower. There, hidden behind a centuries-old ladder, is a carved image of a naked bishop chasing a pig. You raise an eyebrow. The mason grins. "He's been there longer than me," he says. Some say it's a warning, others say it's just Gerald. Here's your historical fact of the day. Graffiti was a surprisingly common and enduring part of medieval culture. In England alone, hundreds of churches contain carved messages dating back to the 12th century. They range from names and prayers to curses, astrological symbols, musical notes, and what can only be described as doodles you'd get suspended for drawing in class. Some graffiti was devotional, pleas to saints or God, written in desperation or hope. Others were just pure chaos, and many were written by people who left no other trace in history. No land records, no family trees. Just Thomas was here, 1347, carved into stone next to a fish with legs. You find a scholar at the scriptorium who lets you look at old manuscripts under guard. That's where things get really weird. Marginalia, those tiny illustrations scribbled in the blank spaces around serious texts, are often full of grotesque and absurd images. Snails jousting knights, rabbits beheading people, priests being pantsed by demons. You ask if these were symbolic. Sometimes, the scholar says, sometimes the scribes were just bored, and that's your quirky fact. Medieval scribes were passive-aggressive icons. They worked for hours copying text by hand, eyes burning, backs aching, patience shredded, and they took it out in the margins. One manuscript ends with the line, "Thank God it is finished." Another says, "This book was copied by a poor and tired scribe. May whoever steals it be eaten by worms." One just reads, "You're too close. Back up." You're not sure if that last one was meant for you or for the monk copying behind him. There's scholarly debate about whether some of this graffiti was ever meant to be seen. Was it secret rebellion? Humour shared between friends? Artistic expression in a world that didn't allow much personal voice? The truth is probably all of the above. These markings reveal the tension between the solemnity of the age and the reality of human nature. People wanted to laugh, complain, flirt, provoke. They just didn't have Twitter. They had stone walls and ink pots. As the day goes on, you begin spotting graffiti everywhere. On a bench in the town square, a crudely drawn cat with a crown. On the back wall of the granary, a recipe for ale, followed by, "It made me see angels." In the corner of the inn's pantry, "Elise is sweet, don't tell my wife." It's like peeling back layers of time to hear voices whispering through the years, equal parts wise, ridiculous, and wildly inappropriate. You spend the afternoon with a group of local teens who've taken to scratching runes into soft stone near the riverbank. "It's our love code," one girl says, showing you a heart surrounded by symbols. "Only we know what it means," you nod. It's probably the same thing a bored scribe once said in 1386, and then you find it, your favourite of the day. On the back of a crumbling village gate, half covered in ivy, someone once carved a full-length poem. Not good poetry, mind you. It rhymes cheese with knees and love with shove. But it's heartfelt. A love letter to someone named Matilda, who apparently had very sharp elbows and a laugh like wind through goats. It's ridiculous. It's real. It's someone's heart, immortalised in crooked lines scratched by candlelight. You walk home with ink-stained fingers and a new appreciation for medieval mischief. Because while kings and popes wrote laws, it was the scribblers, the doodlers, the back-row daydreamers who left behind the truth. That even in a world of plagues and penance, people still found ways to be funny, to be human, to whisper jokes in the margins. And maybe, just maybe, they were laughing at us too, knowing one day, centuries later, someone like you would come along, squint at a farting monk carved into a cathedral door and realise, some things never change. You've spent the better part of the week wading through the medieval ridiculous. Court jesters dodging execution with punchlines, plague doctors dressed like haunted birds, war horses being knighted into oblivion. But today things take a turn, a colder, eerier turn. Because this morning your invitation isn't to a feast or a joust or a gossip-ridden bathhouse. It's to a party, a graveyard party. That's right. Tonight, you're dancing with death, literally as you witness one of the strangest and most unforgettable spectacles in medieval culture, the Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death. It begins at twilight, as most weird things do. You're summoned to the churchyard by tolling bells that don't quite match any prayer hour you know. The sun is sinking low, painting the gravestones gold, and people are gathering, dressed not in mourning blacks but in colourful garments. A few even wear masks. You're confused. Isn't this where funerals happen? Isn't this where solemnity lives? But then someone hands you a sprig of rosemary and whispers, "He's coming," and the hairs on your neck stand up like they've just remembered mortality exists. A drum beats, softly at first, like a heartbeat, then louder, and through the misty air emerges a figure, tall, cloaked, skeletal, a mask surely. It has to be, except the way he moves, the eerie grace of it, the way children stare wide-eyed and don't laugh. It makes you wonder. He carries a flute carved from bone. A violinist follows, then a drummer, and then, bizarrely, a line of dancers in skeleton garb, each one dressed to represent a different walk of life. The king, the knight, the bishop, the merchant, the peasant, even a child. It's an equal opportunity processional of doom. This is the Dance Macabre, a medieval allegory turned ritual turned party with existential dread frosting. The message is simple, brutally clear. Death comes for everyone. Doesn't matter if you're wearing a crown or a turnip sack, if you own a castle or clean the chamber pots. When the dance begins, you join it. And the medieval mind loved this reminder, as horrifying as it was. It was moral instruction wrapped in theatre. You feel it in your bones, no pun intended, as the skeletal dancers form a circle and begin to move in rhythm, beckoning others from the crowd to join. You hesitate, naturally. Then someone, dressed like a plague widow with a veil and painted skull face, grabs your hand and pulls you in. Suddenly you're in it, spinning, stepping, circling. The music is frantic, off-kilter, beautiful in a creepy, minor-key way. You're surrounded by representations of death and the dead, and the living who are dancing not despite mortality, but because of it. Here's your historical fact for the night. The Dance Macabre originated in the 14th century, likely sparked by the trauma of the Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe. It appeared in murals, poetry, plays, and even church art. One of the most famous was painted on the walls of the Church of the Innocents in Paris, a long frieze depicting skeletons dancing with people from every class, hand in hand. The art reminded viewers that death spared no one, and thus they should live virtuously, repent, and not cling too hard to worldly things. It was essentially a medieval pep talk through spookiness. But over time, something shifted. The dance became more than a warning. It became entertainment. By the late Middle Ages, mock funerals and graveyard plays turned into events. Actors donned skull masks and paraded through towns. Some villagers reenacted the dance macabre every All Hallows Eve. You're seeing that evolution tonight, the performance that's both chilling and oddly joyful. People laugh, dance, and cry in equal measure. It's less about fearing death and more about acknowledging it, inviting it in for a glass of wine and a spin around the headstone. There's scholarly debate about how literal these events were. Did entire villages actually dance in cemeteries? Were the murals meant to inspire fear or simply illustrate sermons? Some academics see the dance of death as a deeply symbolic art form, not an actual ritual. Others argue that these dances were performed regularly, especially in areas hard hit by plague and famine, where reminders of mortality were as common as soup. Either way, the imagery stuck. It endured in folk songs, plays, even early printed books, and tonight you're part of it. Your quirky fact. In some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, the danse macabre inspired more than art. It inspired costume processions. Towns would hold death festivals, where people dressed as skeletons and walked from door to door, reminding neighbours to confess their sins and bake more bread. Sometimes the skeletons would even ask for offerings to appease death, kind of like Halloween, if Halloween were designed by philosophy majors with access to skulls and questionable theatre degrees. Back in the graveyard, the music slows. The skeletal figures move in a spiralling pattern now, looping around a single open grave in the centre of the churchyard. One by one, they step forward, speak a line, something cryptic like, "You wore gold, but now wear none," and toss a token into the pit. A ring, a coin, a broken crown, a crumpled letter. Then they turn and vanish into the crowd. It's quiet, no applause, just the wind in the yew trees and the creak of old bones settling. The flute lets out one final note, a sharp descending sigh, and you realise the dance is over. You're left standing there, heart pounding, face flushed, and very aware of the fact that you're standing on about 700 years of buried ancestors. The living drift back toward their homes. You follow slowly, looking at the stars, wondering how many people over how many centuries have danced this same dance, grappled with the same questions. What happens next? Did I do enough? What do I leave behind? But before you get too philosophical, someone pats your shoulder and hands you a steaming mug of mulled cider. You sip. It's spiced with cloves and something that might be regret. You sit on a stone and let it warm your bones, and for all the skulls and silence and scary music, there's a strange peace to it. Like the dance isn't a warning at all, but a kind of permission. To live, to laugh, to be ridiculous, because death is coming anyway. Might as well go down dancing. You wake up with dirt in your ears, candle wax in your hair, and the lingering image of a skeleton politely offering you cider. It takes you a moment to remember last night wasn't a dream. It was a graveyard dance party with an existential crisis on the side. Naturally. So what do you do the next morning to follow up a death disco? You go on a pilgrimage. Kind of. You're not going far, but today you're joining the masses to visit one of the most revered, highly trafficked, and deeply suspicious medieval attractions. A holy relic. Specifically, the toe bone of St. Theodora, which looks suspiciously like a chicken knuckle. The town has been buzzing about it for days. It's miraculous, someone said. It glows in the moonlight, claimed another. It cured my goat, insisted a third, who may have just wanted people to stop asking questions about that goat. Whether it's real, fake, or just extremely well-travelled poultry, the point is, people believe in it. And you, as a curious time traveller with a high tolerance for nonsense, must see it. You follow the crowd to the church where pilgrims and locals have gathered in an impressively disorganised line. The air smells like sweat, incense, and faintly of roasted chestnuts from the enterprising vendor outside. You get the full experience. People clutching rosaries, whispering prayers, kneeling on stone steps, and slipping coins into the offering box so hard it clinks like a gilt gong. At the front of the church, on a velvet cushion inside a gilded reliquary shaped like a tiny foot, sits the relic itself. One ancient, slightly discoloured bone fragment, said to belong to St. Theodora of the Third Miracle, Patroness of bread, travellers and women with mysteriously glowing fingertips. You lean in for a closer look. It's small, curved, definitely not glowing, and definitely, probably, avian. But the priest, a man with impeccable posture and suspiciously clean robes, beams with pride. This, he says, is the very toe that once kicked temptation into the river. You nod solemnly. Everyone else gasps. One woman drops to her knees and weeps. A child touches the glass case and claims her fever vanished. You blink. There's a lot happening here. Here's your historical fact. Relics were a huge part of medieval religious life. From the 4th century onward, the veneration of saints' remains, bones, hair, teeth, bits of clothing, even drops of blood, became central to Christian worship across Europe. Churches competed to acquire them, pilgrims travelled for weeks to see them, and miracles were frequently attributed to their presence. Entire cities were put on the map because of a single bone fragment, and wars were sometimes fought over who got to keep which relic. It was holy marketing, and it worked. But it also created a booming market for fakes. Some were made with decent intentions, copies meant to extend the presence of a saint. Others were full-on scams. There are records of multiple churches claiming to have the same saint's skull, or 3 different femurs from the same holy man. Some saints had enough distributed bones to build entire new skeletons. A few were even assigned relics retroactively, discovered in caves or pulled from rivers with a convenient backstory attached. And that brings us to your quirky fact of the day. At one point, someone claimed to have found the Holy Prepuce, as in the foreskin of baby Jesus. Not one, but over a dozen churches in medieval Europe claimed ownership. It was a theological mess. Debates raged about authenticity, and the Vatican eventually got so tired of the arguments that they officially banned mention of it in the 20th century. But back in the day, people took these things very seriously. If you had a relic, you had pilgrims. If you had pilgrims, you had money. It was piety plus economy, a sanctified business model. Back at the church, a monk in a scratchy robe offers you a ribbon. Touch it to the relic, he says, and keep it with you for protection. You oblige, and now you're the proud owner of a semi-blessed string that smells like incense and feet. People are buying candles, mini reliquary souvenirs, and pamphlets with the saint's story written in awkward rhyming Latin. You pick one up. The poem begins, "Her toe did glow, in fields so low, and smote the sin with righteous blow." You decide not to finish it. There's scholarly debate about whether most medieval people truly believed in every relic they visited. Some likely did, especially the sick, the desperate, or the deeply devout. Others may have seen it more as tradition, obligation, or even entertainment. Pilgrimages were social events, opportunities to travel, eat, gossip, and maybe catch a miracle on the side. Relics made the intangible tangible. Faith had a place, a smell, a shape. Whether the toe was real or not didn't always matter. The belief around it was real enough. You step back outside into the cool afternoon air, watching pilgrims continue to pour in. Some limp, some sing. Some look like they've already written the miracle in their heads. You walk past the chestnut vendor, now aggressively marketing his sun-blessed snacks, and sit on a stone bench to breathe. And you think about it, about how humans, across time, across cultures, always want to touch the divine, to make it real, to bottle it, carry it, keep it in a glass box so we can believe a little harder. Maybe that's silly. Maybe it's sacred. Maybe it's both. But there's something undeniably powerful about how people rally around a bone, a story, a whispered maybe. You tuck your ribbon into your satchel, right next to the notes you took during the urine consultation, and the love poem you found carved into a latrine wall. It's all relics, really. Pieces of human hope, confusion, devotion, and deep, unrelenting weirdness. You're collecting them too, not for blessings, just for understanding. And for the record, that toe was definitely a chicken bone. You awaken with the sound of monks chanting in the distance and the faint scent of candle wax still clinging to your clothes from yesterday's pilgrimage to St. Possibly Poultry's left toe. Today, though, you're heading back indoors, into the shadows, the silence, and the steady scratch of quills across parchment. Because today, you're going to witness one of the most underrated forms of medieval madness, illuminated manuscripts. Specifically, the scribes who made them, the monks who ruined them, and the unholy number of snails that somehow made it into the margins, you're escorted through the cool stone halls of the abbey to the scriptorium, the sacred little workshop where monks have spent centuries hunched over desks in a war against time, boredom, and bad ink. The room is filled with golden afternoon light filtered through high windows, but inside everything feels dim and hushed. You can smell the vellum, the animal glue, the ink, the faint despair. The only sound is scratching, quill on skin, over and over, like a whisper that never ends. A scribe motions you over. He's middle-aged, hunched, wearing a cowl that somehow makes him look both holy and profoundly over it. His fingers are ink-stained, his eyes wild. You peek at his current project, a large psalter with tiny black letters so neatly written it looks like it was printed by tiny holy ants. And then, in the corner of the page, you see it. A rabbit wielding a sword chasing a man in a hood. You blink. The scribe shrugs. "It's for balance," he says. "Here's your historical fact. Illuminated manuscripts were the luxury books of the medieval world, hand-copied and decorated by scribes, often in monasteries, sometimes in royal scriptoria. The most expensive were written on vellum or parchment, prepared animal skin, and illuminated with gold leaf, rare pigments, and incredibly detailed illustrations. They contained religious texts, prayer books, calendars, even bestiaries. But what really sets them apart are the marginalia, the weird, tiny, delightful chaos scribbled around the sacred words. You sit beside the scribe as he mixes pigment, lapis lazuli, ground into powder, mixed with egg white. For Mary's robe, he explains, only the best. Lapis was imported from Afghanistan. It cost more than gold. So yes, monks were essentially painting with powdered luxury while sitting in freezing rooms trying to fend off mice and doubt. No pressure. He holds up a fine brush and shows you how he layers colour into an initial, one of those big decorated letters that begins a chapter. The capital B he's working on has a dragon inside it. The dragon is yawning. Next to it a monk holding a candle, also yawning. You raise an eyebrow. "The prior said it lacked inspiration," the scribe mutters. And that's your quirky fact. Medieval scribes were often secretly hilarious. In between copying lines of scripture, they drew strange, irreverent images in the margins. Knights fighting snails, monkeys playing bagpipes, naked men riding fish, entire scenes that seem to parody the very text they're copying. Some scholars believe the marginalia were meant to balance the seriousness of the content with a little comic relief. Others think it was just bored monks with a sense of humour and too much ink. One famous example comes from the Gorliston Psalter, where there's a rabbit literally decapitating a man with a sword. In another manuscript, a nun is being attacked by a giant, phallus. It's drawn in perfect detail, complete with tiny legs. You ask your scribe about this. He rolls his eyes. "Brother Ethelred," he mutters. "Too much mead, not enough theology." You look through more manuscripts, each one a chaotic blend of piety and nonsense. Some are breathtakingly beautiful. Gold leaf catches the light like a sunrise in miniature. Tiny flowers spiral through page borders. You see illuminated calendars with saints listed for every day, along with symbols for seasonal farming and, occasionally, pigs falling from ladders. Sure, but it's not all whimsy. The work is grueling. Scribes could spend years on a single manuscript. A mistake could mean scraping away the ink or worse, starting over. Some margins have apologies from scribes. "I am so very tired," or "The ink is bad today, forgive the blot." One even says, "This page was copied by a fool." You suspect that one was copied by someone else about the fool. Passive-aggressive marginalia, the original comment section. There's scholarly debate about whether all scribes approved of this chaos. Some monasteries likely banned marginalia, or at least the more graphic kind. Others might have encouraged creativity as a way to keep minds sharp during the dull hours. There's also speculation that not all these illustrations were done by the scribes themselves. Some were added later by different artists, professional illuminators hired to spice up the pages, either to impress patrons or because someone thought a Bible just needed a breakdancing goat. You try your hand at illumination. The scribe hands you a tiny quill, dips it in red ink, and points you toward a margin. "Draw something meaningful," he says. You panic. And then, because your brain is mush and your inspiration is low, you draw a small cat wearing a crown. The scribe nods solemnly. "A noble beast," he says. As the day fades and the shadows stretch across the floor, the scriptorium grows quiet. The scribes begin to clean their tools, roll up their pigments, and light candles. You watch them tuck away their half-finished pages, hours of work, weeks of effort, all stacked neatly in bundles. And you think about how many of these pages never made it past their walls, how many were lost to fire, theft, war, mildew, and how some survived, not because of the holy texts within, but because someone, somewhere, opened a book and saw a rabbit stabbing a man and decided, yes, this deserves to live forever. You walk out into the cool evening with a stained fingertip, an aching neck, and the knowledge that even in the most sacred corners of the medieval world, someone was always doodling something stupid in the margins, and honestly, that feels like hope. By now your medieval misadventure has taken you through sweaty pilgrimages, ghostly graveyard raves, falcon fashion statements, and a level of bodily fluid analysis you're still trying to forget. So when you hear that today you'll be visiting a local trial, you think, finally, something straightforward. Justice, rules, order, maybe even a dramatic courtroom moment with a stern judge slamming a gavel. But of course, this is the Middle Ages, and justice here has its own very special flavour, equal parts superstition, spectacle, and flaming hot nonsense. Today, you're witnessing the glorious absurdity that is trial by ordeal. You're escorted to the village square by a man with a dented helmet and zero expression. He calls himself the bailiff, but looks like he moonlights as a turnip farmer. The square is crowded, buzzing with energy. Onlookers jostle for space. Vendors are selling pies and betting on outcomes. There's a priest blessing a bucket of water like it's preparing for battle. You're pretty sure the judge is drunk. In short, justice is in the air. Or maybe that's just the smell of burning rope. You ask what kind of case this is. A woman's been accused of theft. Someone's prized cloak went missing during a feast. She claims innocence. The villagers, predictably, have opinions. One neighbour is confident it was her. Another swears it was the widow down the lane. But the court, such as it is, has decided to skip the whole evidence thing and go straight to what passes for legal gold here. An ordeal by water. Here's how it works. The accused is tied up, prayed over, and dunked into a pit or barrel of holy water. If she sinks, innocent. If she floats, guilty. That's it. Sink and possibly drown equals free to go. Float equals clearly possessed by the devil and probably a witch. It's the kind of logic that makes you want to scream into a candle. But to the people here, it's sacred, divine. They honestly believe that God will intervene to protect the innocent and expose the wicked. Or at least nudge the water physics a little. You stand near the edge of the water pit as the accused, a thin, pale woman with wild eyes and no shoes, is led forward. A priest recites a long Latin prayer. The bailiff ties her wrists and elbows together, tight enough to make your own arms ache just watching. The crowd leans in. The woman is lowered in. She floats. The priest gasps. The villagers murmur. The bailiff nods solemnly like gravity has just spoken. Guilty, he announces. The woman is pulled from the water, coughing, soaked, and very much outraged. She screams her innocence, but it's no use. A sentence will be passed. It might be public penance. It might be branding. It might be exile. Depends on how dramatic the judge is feeling after lunch. Here's your historical fact. Trial by ordeal was a legal practice across much of Europe during the early and high Middle Ages, often used when evidence or witnesses were lacking. There were many variations: ordeal by fire, by hot iron, by cold water, even by ingestion. Yes, people had to eat cursed bread and wait to see if they died. In all cases, the outcome was considered a sign from God. The church eventually banned these practices in the 13th century, but in many rural areas, they lingered for generations. Because once people believe in a system, no matter how ridiculous, it's hard to let it go. And your quirky fact. Sometimes animals were put on trial. No, really. In parts of France and Switzerland, pigs were prosecuted for manslaughter. They'd be brought to court, given a lawyer, tried and sentenced. There are records of pigs being hanged for killing children. Rats were summoned to appear for crop destruction. One town even excommunicated a swarm of locusts. You picture a beetle in tiny manacles and wonder if reality has always been this unhinged. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how symbolic these ordeals were. Some argue they were meant to pressure confessions or reinforce communal values. not actually serve as forensic science. Others suggest many trials were manipulated behind the scenes, heating irons less than they claimed, choosing float-friendly bodies for dunkings. And still others think it was all sincere. People genuinely trusted divine will to guide them, because without science or law as we know it, what else did they have? As the accused is led away, the crowd disperses like it's intermission at the theatre. Children imitate her, floating, splashing in nearby puddles. The bailiff wipes his hands and shrugs. "Water knows," he says. You feel a deep need to lie down in a field. But your day isn't over. Next up is a trial by combat. You're not kidding. Two men, both shirtless, both furious, both equally convinced the other stole a prize pig, are about to fight for justice. The winner goes home innocent. The loser, well, hope he made peace with his gods. You find a seat on a barrel as the referee explains the rules. No weapons longer than a forearm, no eye gouging, and absolutely no biting the nose off. Again, the combat begins. It's chaotic, sweaty, and wildly uncoordinated. You watch as one man slips in the mud, the other trips over his own rage, and eventually both are just slapping each other with what can only be described as panicked dignity. The crowd is loving it. The pig watches from a pen, completely unfazed. Eventually one man pins the other. The judge declares him innocent. A priest blesses him. The loser gets bandaged and a fine. The pig presumably goes home with neither of them because it turns out it belonged to the widow after all. Justice. As the sun sets, you walk back to your room with the sounds of legal resolution echoing behind you. Cheering, arguing, one guy yelling, "That was my nose rule!" and the distant oink of a pig enjoying its unexpected fame. You sit on your cot and stare at the ceiling, thinking about how much trust we put into systems, how sometimes they're built on reason, and sometimes they're built on floating. And yet somehow civilization survived. Just maybe don't drink the water. You wake up the next morning already exhausted, emotionally drained by the memory of yesterday's floating trial and pig-related brawl. You've watched people gamble with their lives on the whims of gravity and bad aim, and somehow the pig is still the only one who got away clean. But today offers something entirely different. Still absurd, still medieval, but with fewer bodily injuries and slightly more velvet. Today, you're diving into the social battlefield of the courtly love tradition, a world where romantic suffering is a competitive sport, love letters are weapons, and no one's allowed to be happy for more than 12 minutes. It starts innocently enough. You're invited to the manor for a salon of love, which sounds romantic, maybe even a little dreamy, until you arrive and realise it's more like a live-action poetry slam, hosted by people who haven't had a genuine emotion in years. The room is draped in red cloth. Candles flicker in wall sconces, and the air smells of roses, wine, and desperation. Nobles, men and women alike, are dressed to the absolute nines, feathers and jewels and brocade sleeves so long they double as small tents. Everyone's here to talk about love, but not the healthy kind. The idealised, torment-filled, probably imaginary kind. A herald announces the first event, a debate on the nature of true affection. You're handed a cup of wine and told to sit quietly unless you've recently been rejected in a particularly poetic way. Naturally, half the room raises their hands. Two speakers step forward, one wearing a golden mask and the other a blue velvet hat so large it could serve as a livestock shelter. They proceed to argue about whether it's nobler to suffer unrequited love for a perfect lady than to actually, be in a relationship. Spoiler alert, suffering wins. Here's your historical fact. Courtly love emerged in the 12th century, particularly in the courts of southern France, and quickly spread throughout Europe. It was a stylized, almost theatrical form of romantic expression, especially popular among nobles. In its purest form, courtly love was unconsummated and often directed at someone already married. The point wasn't to have the person, it was to pine for them, write poetry about how unattainable they were, and earn moral/spiritual enlightenment through prolonged emotional agony. Real love, boring, forbidden longing, now that's art. You're soon swept into a game called the Lover's Judgment. Two nobles act out a dramatic breakup over an imaginary misunderstanding involving a scarf, a falcon, and a misunderstanding at a tournament. A third noble plays the Queen of Love, who must decide which one deserves to be forgiven. You think she'll choose the man who confessed, cried, and offered a very sad mandolin solo. Instead, she chooses the woman for having the audacity to maintain her virtue while surrounded by temptation. The crowd nods. Someone claps. The man sulks and recites a sonnet called "My Heart is But a Rotting Pear." You sip your wine. Here's your quirky fact. Entire love courts existed in the Middle Ages, often presided over by noblewomen. These were semi-theatrical gatherings where matters of love were debated like court cases. Was a particular gesture too bold? Did a lover wait too long to confess? Should someone return a glove that was thrown in jealousy? These weren't real legal courts, of course, but they were serious in tone and prestige. Nobles prided themselves on mastering the rules of love the way others mastered swordplay. A troubadour appears next, lute in hand, and sings a tragic ballad about falling in love with a woman who mistook him for a stable boy. You think it's going well until the last verse, where he dramatically throws himself onto the floor and declares he'll never smile again until she returns his hat. Everyone swoons. You're not sure if it's from the performance or the sheer weight of the social expectations being hurled around like flower petals at a funeral. And there's plenty to swoon over. The entire event is a swirl of coded language, dramatic glances, and emotional tightrope walking. Lovers are supposed to suffer, but elegantly. Desire must be hinted at, but never fulfilled. And expressing too much joy, tasteless. The goal isn't happiness, it's ennoblement through longing. Courtly love elevates the lover, supposedly refining their soul through exquisite torment. You try writing a love poem yourself, but only manage to rhyme dove with shove, before giving up and drawing a heart with a crack in it. Very avant-garde. There's scholarly debate about how much courtly love reflected real medieval relationships. Some argue it was mostly a literary invention, a poetic game indulged in by bored aristocrats who needed a new outlet for their feelings, or lack thereof. Others point to letters, diaries, and even laws that suggest these rituals of love did influence how people behaved, how they flirted, and how they justified affairs or arranged marriages. It's unclear where the fantasy ended and reality began, but then again, that's kind of the point. By mid-afternoon, the Salon of Love turns into a round of wagered affections. Participants challenge each other to complete tasks, write the best poem, compose a love riddle, deliver a speech on why love is like an onion. Yes, really. With the winner receiving a token from the Queen of Love's sash. You watch as grown men nearly come to blows over the honour of kissing a lady's glove. One of them sobs into his own sleeve. A lute string snaps. Someone passes out from emotional sincerity. You decide to quietly slip outside for some air. In the garden, a young couple stands in silence, just looking at each other. No poems, no swooning, just two people standing beneath a tree. You exhale. Maybe, in the cracks of this hyper-stylized theatre, real feelings still manage to grow. But don't worry, they'll probably write a sonnet about it, and it'll be unbearably sad. Back in your room, you sit by the window with your own cup of wine, rereading the love poem someone slipped into your cloak pocket. It's handwritten, full of crossed-out lines and smudged ink, and ends with, "If you smile at me, I shall weep, and if you do not, I shall perish. Also, your nose is very noble." You smile, just a little, then you weep, elegantly, for love, or whatever this is. You wake up still clutching last night's tragic love poem like it's a breakup letter from someone you've never met. It's a little crumpled, maybe even tear-stained, although you'll claim that was condensation from your wine cup. Either way, you've had enough of emotional duels and velvet heartbreaks. You need something different today, something with less sighing and more smashing. Luckily, today's medieval absurdity delivers in full metal and full volume. Welcome to the thrilling, confusing, often idiotic world of tournaments, where chivalry and violence hold hands while galloping at full speed toward mutual destruction. The first sign that today is not going to be gentle is the noise. You're awoken by the thundering clatter of hooves and the unmistakable scream of a man being unceremoniously knocked off a horse. From your window you can already see the tournament field, flags flapping in the wind, wooden barricades being hammered into place, and a large crowd forming, half of them drunk, all of them loud. The air smells like sweat, hay, leather, and fried something. This is not a love salon. This is medieval, WWE, and everyone's here for the mayhem. You arrive at the field just in time for the parade of knights. They're in full armour, glinting in the morning sun, banners streaming behind them, horses adorned in elaborate caparisons covered in family crests, mythological creatures, and, occasionally, what looks like an angry cheese wheel. The trumpets blare. The crowd roars. Each knight does a dramatic lap while trying very hard not to look like they're sweating to death inside their plate mail. a herald steps forward to announce the rules. "Today's contest," he declares, "shall include jousts, melees, foot combat, and the contest of the thrown cabbage." You blink. He doesn't elaborate. Instead, a squire blows a horn so hard he nearly passes out, and the jousting begins. Here's your historical fact. Tournaments were popular from the 12th century onward, both as training for real battle and as entertainment for nobles and peasants alike. They were incredibly dangerous, often fatal, and sometimes banned by the church for being too chaotic. Despite that, they became central to knightly culture. A knight's fame, fortune, and marriage prospects often hinged on how well he could knock another man off a horse using a wooden stick while wearing 60 pounds of armour. Romance. The first match features a French knight named Guy de Montigny and an Englishman called Sir Edwin the Pale. He is in fact disturbingly pale. They charge at each other full speed, lances out, armour clanging, and absolutely miss by a mile. The crowd jeers, the knights circle back, try again. This time they hit. Barely. The lances splinter, Sir Edwin tilts sideways like a collapsing bookshelf, and Guy throws his arms up like he's won an Oscar. The crowd cheers. The loser is dragged off and handed a roast chicken leg and a pity cider. Next up is the melee, a chaotic team battle that starts with trumpets and ends with several knights forgetting which side they're on. You watch a group of 4 men in full armour trip over each other while trying to wrestle a banner out of a shrub. One yells, "For the honour of Lady Winifred," and promptly gets tackled by a teenager with a stick. It's magnificent. Here's your quirky fact. Some knights became tournament celebrities, known across kingdoms for their prowess. They had fans, merch, usually in the form of embroidered badges, and occasionally even groupies. A few became so famous that they were accused of cheating or using sorcery. One German knight, Hans Talhofer, even wrote a combat manual full of illustrated fight moves, some useful, some wildly impractical, including one where you throw a cloak over your enemy's head and punch him in the stomach while shouting something poetic. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about whether tournaments were more sport or spectacle. On one hand, they were brutal training grounds. On the other, they were theatrical displays meant to show off wealth, status, and chivalric virtue. The answer is probably yes. They were both. Knights fought for glory, yes, but also for ladies' favours, literally ribbons or sleeves tied to their armour, prize money, or just the right to say, "I didn't die horribly today and look how shiny my helmet is." You're pulled into the next event somewhat against your will by a gaggle of laughing squires. It's the contest of the thrown cabbage, which turns out to be exactly what it sounds like. 2 lines of villagers and low-ranking knights hurl heads of cabbage at one another across a rope line. The goal? Unclear. The entertainment value? Immense. You dodge a flying cabbage that explodes at your feet like a crunchy green grenade. One man scores a direct hit to his opponent's chest and is carried away like a war hero. After a few more bruised ribs, a celebratory chicken toss, and a dramatic reading of one knight's last will and testament. He's fine, just very theatrical. The day winds down. The winners are announced, prizes are handed out, gold coins, fine cloaks, a lute, and for some reason, a goat named Archibald. One knight offers his goat to a noblewoman in exchange for a kiss. She declines. Archibald is unimpressed. You sit on a hay bale as the sun sets over the trampled field, the air buzzing with post-battle laughter, and the occasional groan of someone who absolutely broke a rib but won't admit it. Someone hands you a flask of wine and a chunk of bread. The knight beside you, his helmet dented, his pride intact, sighs. "Did you see my charge?" he asks. You nod. "I think you hit a tree," he grins. A worthy foe. And in that moment, you realise something important. In a world where actual war was horrific, unrelenting, and full of real consequences, tournaments were a way to simulate honour without the horror. They were messy, yes, often ridiculous. But they let knights become legends. Peasants cheer like kings, and everyone forget for a moment that life was short, brutal, and filled with snails wielding swords in the margins of books. You tip your imaginary visor to the moon and wonder what your herald name would be. Sir Stumbles-a-lot, the Whispering Dagger, the Duke of Dodging Cabbages. Doesn't matter. Today you survived the tournament. You are victorious. You wake up sore, not from battle, but from laughing so hard at yesterday's cabbage warfare, and the knight who proudly declared victory after being out-jousted by a shrub. Your ears still ring from the cheers, your boots are crusted with mud, and a suspicious bruise on your shin suggests someone mistook you for a square mid-melee. you consider taking it easy today. Maybe a walk by the river or a quiet nap under a tree. But the universe has other plans, and those plans involve a very specific kind of medieval absurdity. Sumptuary laws, a bizarre set of fashion rules that determined who could wear what, based entirely on class, gender, paranoia, and the deep medieval fear that poor people might look a little too fancy. You're summoned to the town hall by a man wearing a hat that looks like someone tried to make a birdhouse out of silk and ambition. He's the Warden of Dress, an actual title apparently, and he informs you that a new round of clothing inspections is underway. The goal? To ensure that no one, absolutely no one, is wearing above their station. You blink. He hands you a scroll detailing the fines for unauthorised fur display, excessive shoe length, and, no kidding, unlawful embroidery of dragons. The square is set up like a low-budget fashion court. A nobleman sits at a table with a quill, a list, and a very punchable sense of authority. Villagers are brought forward one by one. Their outfits are examined, measured, judged. A woman is fined for wearing a girdle with silver accents. A baker's apprentice is accused of donning buttons meant for a man of property. One poor soul is charged with hat fraud, which seems to mean his cap is too pointy for his status. You try not to laugh. You fail. Here's your historical fact. Sumptuary laws were a real and widespread phenomenon in medieval and Renaissance Europe. These laws were designed to regulate consumption, especially clothing based on social class, gender, occupation, and even religion. The idea was to preserve the social hierarchy and prevent lower classes from pretending to be higher than they were. Authorities worried that if a merchant started dressing like a lord, or a butcher wore velvet, the entire fragile order of the world might collapse. So they passed laws to keep people firmly in their fashion lanes. In England, for example, only royalty could wear purple silk. Certain furs, like ermine, were restricted to the aristocracy. Decorative bands of gold thread were reserved for knights and up. Shoes with long points, called crackawees, were regulated by rank. The longer your toes, the higher your status. And yes, people got very creative about bending those rules. Some wore illegal fabrics inside their garments. Others attached gold trim with removable stitches in case of sudden inspection. Smugglers brought in forbidden dyes like they were contraband spice. Back in the square, the fashion court pauses as a tailor is dragged forward. His crime? Making a doublet with sleeves too puffed for common decency. He protests. "The puffing was modest," he shouts, arms flailing dramatically. The judge is unmoved. That puff could destabilise a county. A fine is issued. The crowd boos. You start to think you've entered a Monty Python sketch that's gone on for far too long. And here's your quirky fact. Animals weren't always safe from sumptuary excesses either. In some wealthy courts, people dressed their pets, especially dogs and monkeys, in miniature versions of human outfits. There's a record of a noble's dog being fitted with a fur-lined cape and velvet slippers. This naturally led to sumptuary laws being expanded to forbid display of luxury on beasts, which is perhaps the most medieval sentence that has ever existed. There's scholarly debate about how effective these laws actually were. On paper, they were strict. Fines, confiscations, even imprisonment for repeat offences. But enforcement was often spotty, and wealthy merchants frequently skirted the rules with creative tailoring or quiet bribes. Some historians argue the laws were more about reinforcing ideals than controlling behaviour. Others suggest they were tools of political manipulation, used to punish rivals or curry favour with specific classes. Either way, they reveal a deep anxiety about appearance, identity, and control. As the fashion court continues, you're approached by a local merchant, a clever-looking woman in surprisingly simple wool robes. "You want to see something ridiculous," she whispers. You nod. She leads you behind her shop and reveals a hidden wardrobe. Inside, dozens of band garments, silk hoods, squirrel fur trim, a belt buckle shaped like a swan. "I rent them out," she says proudly. "Discretion guaranteed." You stare in awe. She's basically running a medieval fashion speakeasy. You try on a surcoat that would absolutely get you fined. Velvet, gold thread, embroidered with suns. You feel like a rich time-travelling wizard. Then you try the shoes. So long in the toe they require a little chain to keep from flopping. You nearly trip into a bucket. The merchant cackles. "You'll need practice," she says. As evening approaches, a grand noble arrives in the square, draped in layers of fabric so elaborate it takes 2 servants to carry his train. The warden of dress watches nervously. This man is above the law. His hat alone could bankrupt a town. But his presence is a flex. Look what I can wear. You, peasant, cannot. He glides past, robes fluttering, shoes curved like boat prows. No one dares speak. You head back to your room with a borrowed scarf, technically contraband, feeling both fabulous and very much not arrested. You sit by the fire, thinking about how fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't just clothing, it was code. It told people who you were, where you stood, who you were allowed to love, fight or marry. But it also gave people power. A well-cut tunic could say, "I'm rising." A band colour could whisper, "I don't care what the laws say, I belong." And sometimes, a very illegal hat just makes you feel powerful. The morning fog curls low around the thatched roofs as you step into your boots for one final stroll through this era of lice, loots, and lawless logic. Your cloak still smells faintly of forbidden fashion, and your thighs are sore from yesterday's dangerously long shoes. But today is different. There's no tournament, no relic, no toe-related miracle. Today, the village prepares for something far more important, far more unifying, and somehow far more chaotic. A feast day. Not just any feast day either. Today is the celebration of St. Hubert the Mild, patron of hunters, vegetables, and accidental fasting. Translation: everyone's about to eat like it's their last day alive, assuming they haven't already been excommunicated for stealing pie. The square is already humming with energy. Tables are being dragged out, garlands strung up between buildings, and large animals roasted over open flames that look one wind gust away from taking down a bakery. Children dash about waving ribbons, while somewhere a band of minstrels warms up by violently arguing about what key their hurdy-gurdy is in. The air smells like smoke, honey, spiced meat, and the unmistakable anxiety of a man who forgot to order the bread cart. Feast days in the Middle Ages were more than just excuses to eat too much and complain about it later. They were calendar-breaking, obligation-shattering communal exhalations. The church calendar was filled with them. Some villages had dozens each year, celebrating everything from major saints to local holy people, minor miracles, harvests, or vague blessings like, "Thank you, God, for not letting the river swallow us this week." Work stopped. Bells rang. Ale flowed. And every class of person, from the lowliest pig boy to the guy who owned the pig, came together to eat, gossip, flirt, and occasionally fight in a cabbage-induced haze. Here's your historical fact. Medieval Europe had over 100 officially recognised feast days in some regions, not counting Sundays or local festivals. In theory, they were sacred, days of worship and prayer. In practice, they were festivals, markets, parades, and food-fueled frenzies. Towns would empty their stores of meat, ale, bread, and fruit. Nobles threw lavish banquets. Peasants made stews from whatever hadn't spoiled. And the church, in its infinite flexibility, usually just went along with it, so long as someone lit a candle and didn't try to canonize their goat. You find yourself helping a baker arrange pies on a cart shaped like a castle. Meat pies, fruit pies, ale pies, one that's just a crust filled with shame, he says cheerfully. A child tries to steal one. He smacks her hand with a spoon and hands her a smaller pie as a peace offering. It's tradition. Theft is practically part of the feast. Musicians begin their first song of the day, a tune about St. Hubert convincing a bear to stop eating monks. It's unclear whether it's historical or satirical, but people are clapping in time, so it hardly matters. You're pulled into a ring dance by a group of women who smell of lavender and baked apples. You do your best, stumbling through the steps with the grace of a cat wearing stilts. No one cares. It's feast day. Even mistakes are celebratory. You take a break near the roast boar, now surrounded by people arguing over whether the apple in its mouth counts as a vegetable. A local friar joins you, mouthful of barley bread. St. Hubert once ate nothing but turnips for 40 days, he says proudly, then bites into a sausage the size of your forearm. We do this in his honour. You nod slowly, wondering what part of the turnip diet includes candied plums soaked in mead. Probably the best part. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval feast days featured the Feast of Fools, where roles were reversed. Commoners mocked clergy, servants dressed as lords, and mock sermons were preached by drunk choir boys. These events were technically frowned upon but wildly popular, blurring the line between sacred and profane in the best, most unhinged way possible. At one such feast, a donkey was led into a church, draped in vestments, and preached to for an hour while people sang songs with lyrics like, "Hee-haw! Father Donkey! Bless us!" You ask if anything like that happens here. The friar grins. Wait until the pudding race. There's scholarly debate over whether these feast day revelries were subversive or simply cathartic. Did they challenge authority, or reinforce it by giving people a controlled space to blow off steam? Some argue they were essential for social cohesion, a moment when the pressures of hierarchy loosened. Others think they were just excuses to drink. You personally believe the truth lies somewhere between the third pie and the fourth mug of mead. By afternoon, the games begin. Sack races, apple bobbing, something involving a greased pig and deeply confused rules. One elderly man wins the pudding race, having strapped his dessert to his head and sprinted full speed into the cheese tent. No one questions it. You end up in a friendly arm wrestling match against a blacksmith who lets you win out of pity, then gives you a necklace made of pastry as a trophy. You're not sure whether to wear it or eat it. You choose both. Towards sunset, the final event of the day begins, the feast parade. Tables are pushed together, creating one massive, chaotic banquet stretching the length of the square. Everyone sits, everyone eats. Children crawl under benches. Dogs sneak scraps. A noble to your left insists you try his family's secret honey wine, which turns out to be 90% regret. The man across from you sings a song with only one word, meat. Candles are lit. Bells ring in the distance. The village choir sings a surprisingly emotional hymn about St. Hubert and his turnip-induced enlightenment. People cry. One woman drops her pudding out of sheer spiritual ecstasy. Or maybe it just slipped. You sit there, stuffed, sun-warmed, dizzy with laughter and song and the slow burn of overly spiced goose, and you realise this isn't just a celebration, it's a declaration, a rebellion against the grey, hard world these people live in, against disease, hunger, war, and endless taxes. It's joy in spite of it all. A table big enough for everyone, even if some folks have to stand and eat off a pig's skull. You lean back, sip something that might be beer or possibly shoe polish, and watch the stars rise over the rooftops. And you think, medieval people may have had strange fashion laws, ridiculous justice systems, and a deeply unsettling obsession with urine. But when it came to feasting, they got it right. Live while you can. Eat like you mean it. Praise a turnip once in a while. Tomorrow it's back to toil. But tonight the pudding is sacred.